Welcome, friend. If you're here, it means you're ready to rest. Please lower the volume to a soft, gentle hum. Let it whisper in the background, just enough for your mind to follow without strain. Close your eyes, lie still. Let the world fall away piece by piece. Tonight, we begin our very first story in the series, Boring History for Sleep. It's not exciting, it's not loud, it's just calm. A quiet journey into the past, where nothing much happens, and that's the beauty of it. This is the story of how the Phoenicians gently spread their alphabet. Before we begin, if you enjoy drifting off to gentle stories like this, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel so you'll have something soft to fall asleep to every night. Now, let us begin. In the soft hush of time long past, before loud empires roared and great walls were raised against the sky, there was the sea. And on that sea, rocking quietly in gentle waves, sailed the Phoenicians. They were not conquerors. They did not build vast armies. They did not demand obedience with spears or swords. What they offered instead was something quieter, something subtle. They brought with them goods, yes, purple dye, cedar wood, glass, and woven cloth. But more than that, they brought a way to remember things, a way to write things down, a set of simple symbols passed quietly from hand to hand, ship to ship, shore to shore. And that was their alphabet. The world at the time was filled with complicated scripts, cuneiforms carved into clay, hieroglyphs painted carefully on stone. Beautiful, yes, but difficult, reserved for scribes and priests. It took years to learn them, and even then, only a few could read. But the Phoenician script was different. It had no pictures of birds or eyes or suns, just sounds, just letters, 22 of them. Each one tied not to meaning, but to sound. Anyone who spoke could learn it. Anyone who learned it could write. And that changed everything, quietly. The Phoenicians themselves lived in a narrow strip of land between mountains and sea, in what is now Lebanon. Their cities were small but busy. Tyre, Sidon, Byblos. They were traders by nature, and their ships, small and nimble, slipped between harbors, carrying goods and stories. The alphabet traveled with them, carved into wooden tablets, etched into pots, scratched onto cargo tags. At first, only their neighbors noticed. Small city-states around the Mediterranean began to borrow the symbols. They made small changes, tweaks, additions, but the core remained. Sound-based, simple, portable. The Greeks saw it and smiled. They took it, added vowels, adapted it to their tongue. And so the Greek alphabet was born. From there, the Romans. From the Romans, to us. The letters you see on your screen, the words you hear me whisper, trace back quietly to those Phoenician traders. But this story isn't loud. It doesn't crash like bronze weapons or echo like marble speeches. It hums, softly, like oars dipping in water, like the hush of sails catching a quiet breeze, like a language drifting into sleep. The Phoenicians were not storytellers in the dramatic sense, but they gave the world the tools to tell its own stories, and they did it without fanfare. Their names are mostly forgotten, their cities are ruins, their gods lie buried beneath layers of time. But the alphabet lives. Every book you've ever read, every note you've ever written, every message you've typed to someone you love, was made possible because they decided one day that writing didn't have to be difficult, that it could be simple, that it could be shared, not hoarded, not mystified, just used. Over time, the traders faded. Carthage fell. Tyre was conquered. But even as their temples crumbled, the letters did not. They kept floating, quietly. From papyrus to parchment, from printing presses to keyboards, from ship decks to glowing screens. You don't have to thank them. They never asked to be thanked. That was not their way. All they wanted was to trade, to sail, to move. And so, even now, while you rest here in this soft silence, their legacy is still moving, gently, like tide water, through every story you read, every poem you hear, every quiet voice that puts you to sleep. In the next part, we will trace how these letters reached the hands of the Greeks, and how tiny changes in shape and sound would ripple through time. But for now, let your mind drift, like one of their old ships, toward the edge of rest. As we continue drifting through the slow current of history, imagine a world where the sun rises quietly over whitewashed stone villages, where olive trees sway gently in the breeze, and the voices of fishermen echo off the rocky shores of early Greece. The Mediterranean was not just a sea, it was a soft thread that stitched cultures together, and along that thread, the Phoenician alphabet floated, gently but persistently. By the time it reached the Greeks, it had already proven itself useful, practical, compact, efficient. But the Greeks were thinkers, philosophers, poets. They did not just borrow, they adapted. They observed the Phoenician letters and made small, meaningful changes. Some of the sounds in the Phoenician tongue did not exist in Greek. So rather than discard the extra letters, the Greeks did something quietly revolutionary. They repurposed them. They created vowels. Before this moment, most alphabets were consonant-based. Readers had to guess the sounds in between. But the Greeks added clarity, structure, breath. The sounds of A, E, I, O, and U began to appear, not as guesses, but as letters. This made reading easier, more fluid, more human. A person could now speak what was written without needing prior knowledge of the content. And so, for the first time in history, literacy began to stretch beyond the professional scribe or temple priest. It became possible for merchants, sailors, farmers, even children, to read and write. Quietly, this shifted the balance of knowledge. The alphabet was no longer a guarded secret. It was a shared tool, and this shift began with the Phoenicians and evolved through the Greeks. The earliest Greek inscriptions carved in stone, often in boustrophodon style, where lines reversed direction like the turning of an ox in a field, carried this new form. They were not poetry at first. They were lists, names, inventories. But with time came verses, myths, laws, plays. The alphabet became not just a record, but a voice. It allowed thought to be carried across distance and time, undistorted. And yet this transformation was quiet. It did not erupt in fire. It whispered, line by line, onto clay, onto stone, onto wax tablets and scrolls. The Phoenician letters, once used for trade, now held the thoughts of philosophers like Plato, the logic of Aristotle, the rhythm of Homer. Imagine sitting in a small classroom in Athens under open sky, a child slowly tracing each letter into the sand. Alpha, beta, gamma. Not knowing, perhaps, that these symbols came from across the sea, that each shape had once been carved by a trader labeling his cargo, that these letters had sailed miles before they ever reached Greek shores. And yet here they were, teaching a generation to think in new ways, to question, to argue, to dream. And though time passed, the form of the letters shifted only slightly. Their shapes became smoother, more curved, more symmetrical. Stone gave way to parchment. Styluses gave way to pens. But the sounds remained. The simplicity remained. In this quiet revolution, the Greeks did not just adopt a script, they spread it. Through colonies like Naples and Marseille, through theaters and marketplaces, the alphabet moved westward, and always it carried with it the invisible whisper of its origins, Phoenicia. The Greek alphabet would eventually give rise to the Latin script, the one we use today. But here, in this moment, in this chapter of the story, it is still cradled in Greek hands, being shaped gently by minds that sought order and reason. The alphabet became a bridge between spoken word and eternal record, between fleeting thought and permanent inscription. It gave form to memory, it gave form to law, and slowly it gave form to literature. As your body settles deeper into rest, imagine that, letters drifting across time, like dust motes in sunlight, changing hands but never disappearing, always used, never worshipped, always practical yet deeply profound. In the next part, we'll follow this alphabet's quiet passage from Greece to Rome, and how the Latin world would embrace and expand what the Phoenicians had sparked and the Greeks had refined. But for now, stay still. Let the shapes of letters dissolve in your mind. Let the waves of thought ebb away. Sleep is near, and history waits patiently. The sea was still the same. Centuries had passed, but its surface remained steady, stretching from east to west like a soft blue ribbon, tying together the quiet trade of culture. The Phoenicians had given the world a gift of simplicity. The Greeks had shaped it with thought. Now, as the tides of history moved again, the Romans reached for that same thread, and in their firm, deliberate hands, the alphabet began another transformation. Still gentle, still quiet, but now with a touch of permanence. The Romans admired structure. Their roads were straight, their cities ordered, their laws carved into tablets for all to see. So when they encountered the Greek alphabet, they saw more than sound. They saw the foundation of something universal. They adapted the script to Latin, the language of shepherds and soldiers, of senators and scribes. The transition was subtle. Letters changed slightly in shape. A few were dropped, others were added. The letter C began to take the place of K in many words. V stood in for both vowel and consonant. The alphabet took on a form that was tighter, more formal, more uniform. But still, at its core, it was Phoenician. It carried the bones of a writing system first etched on clay tablets, carried by ships of cedar and sail. And now it was being etched into marble, chiseled into arches, painted onto scrolls, carried by riders along Roman roads that never seemed to end. The Roman Empire was vast, stretching from the edges of Scotland to the sands of Syria, from the rivers of Germany to the deserts of North Africa. And with every new province, every new town, came a familiar set of shapes, letters, Latin letters. The alphabet moved with soldiers, with merchants, with officials. It was stamped on coins, printed on milestones, carved above doorways, and slowly, with every inscription, the alphabet settled in. It became part of everyday life, practical, predictable, permanent. Roman children in dusty courtyards copied the letters onto wax tablets with short styluses, their hands clumsy but learning. Public criers read proclamations written in these symbols. Poets like Virgil and Horace crafted verses using the same letters born from traders long forgotten. And once again, the alphabet did not shout. It did not demand. It simply stayed. It endured. Even as the Roman Empire swelled and fractured, the letters remained. And when emperors fell and barbarians crossed borders, when palaces burned and cities were abandoned, the alphabet quietly survived. Monks in candlelit rooms copied ancient texts, letter by letter, onto parchment. Each curve and line preserved not just the content, but the shape of memory itself. The alphabet became sacred, not because it was divine, but because it held so much. History, law, thought, language, every word passed down was built from it. And though the Roman Empire eventually faded into memory, the Latin alphabet, refined from Greek, shaped from Phoenician, was just beginning its journey. It would outlive its creators, outlast stone and steel. As the medieval world took form, the letters slipped into monasteries, into castles, into early schools and courts. They adapted again, of course. The shapes curved with time, styles emerged, Carolingian, Gothic, Romanesque, but the core was unchanged. 20-some letters, strung into meaning, passed along not by force, but by usefulness. And still, no one knew the names of the first Phoenician scribes who scratched lines into clay. No monuments were raised for them, no statues carved. But their legacy lived in every Roman citizen who ever read a law, every scribe who ever copied a scroll, every child who ever recited the letters out loud beneath the Mediterranean sun. It was a quiet legacy, and perhaps that is why it survived. Noise fades, stone crumbles, but a simple tool, useful, shareable, easy to teach, endures. It slips from one hand to the next, from one age to another, without needing to be remembered, only used. And so, as your body drifts deeper into stillness, and your thoughts slow like a ship at rest, know this: the letters we now call ordinary were once extraordinary, and in their simplicity, they remain miraculous. In the next part, we will step gently into the medieval world, where scribes with aching fingers and tired eyes kept the alphabet alive through war, famine, silence, and centuries. But for now, rest. Let the waves go quiet. Let the letters fall like soft rain across your thoughts. Let history keep watch while you sleep. As the ancient world dimmed and the flicker of empire gave way to the soft hush of medieval life, the alphabet did not vanish. It retreated quietly into the corners of monasteries and the careful hands of scribes. The grand forums and marble libraries of Rome grew cold and cracked. The roads, once bustling with messengers and carts, slowed to silence. But within the thick walls of monasteries, the alphabet continued its slow journey, sheltered by candlelight, ink, and silence. Imagine a monk, hunched over a wooden desk, surrounded by the soft scratching of quills. Outside, the wind might howl against stone walls, but inside, all was still. Line after line, page after page, he copied not just words but entire worlds, stories, prayers, poems, laws. Each letter drawn with patience, with reverence, with quiet care. It was in these quiet acts of repetition that the alphabet endured. No longer passed by sea or trade, it moved from hand to hand in ink and parchment. The Latin script, once a tool of empire, now became a vessel of faith and memory. Most people could not read during this time. Books were rare, precious things. Pages made from stretched calfskin, ink from crushed berries, pigments ground and mixed with oils. A single book might take months or years to complete. But the letters remained simple, familiar, each one a building block. An A was still an A B was still a B, just as it had been in Phoenician days, though its shape had changed. This quiet consistency became the foundation for knowledge during uncertain times. As kingdoms rose and fell, as plagues swept through towns, as battles echoed in distant valleys, the letters did not change. They remained, waiting patiently for eyes to find them. The Carolingian minuscule emerged, a writing style that made reading easier, with clear spaces between words, rounded letters, and logical flow. This innovation, born of simplicity, spread through Europe like a soft breeze through open fields, not by decree, not by conquest, but because it worked, because it was easier to read. And as always, that was the alphabet's strength. Not in brilliance, but in usefulness. Later, as universities were founded in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, the letters moved once more. This time not just in prayer books, but in science, philosophy, and law. The scribes of the medieval world did not know they were preserving the remnants of a system that had floated across time for over 1,000 years. They were simply doing their task, one letter at a time, and each task became a link, a chain that stretched from Tyre and Sidon to the quiet chapels of England and France. The alphabet became part of music, used to notate chants and hymns. It appeared in ledgers, tracking the flow of grain, coin, and land. It whispered through love letters, royal decrees, and secret missives carried by messengers through forests and across borders. Always quiet, always steady. And while kings ruled with swords, the real power, the one that lasted, was in these shapes, these curves and lines that carried meaning even when voices failed, even when stories were forgotten. The printing press had not yet come. Mass literacy was a distant dream. But even now, even then, the alphabet was preparing, evolving slowly, waiting for the moment it would explode across the world in ink and type. But here, in this chapter, in the dim candlelit scriptoriums of the Middle Ages, the alphabet held its breath. It waited. And while it waited, it whispered. It whispered to the tired eyes of scribes who stayed up through long winters, to the young novices tracing letters on slate, to the readers who, by firelight, mouthed the words one syllable at a time. The alphabet had become more than a tool. It was now a thread of continuity, a soft, durable rope tying together generations through dark and quiet centuries. And even if the world outside changed, the letters remained the same, a comfort, a pattern, a promise. In the next part, we will step into a world transformed by invention, the printing press, and watch how the alphabet, once etched into clay, painted on papyrus, and copied by hand, found a new speed, a new voice, and a new permanence. But for now, let your thoughts slow with the monks. Let your breathing match the rhythm of a steady hand copying line after line. Let your mind rest in the silence between words, where history sleeps and letters wait patiently to be read again. The world began to stir. After centuries of quiet copying and whispered words, something changed. Not suddenly, but steadily, like a door opening to let in more light. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century marked a turning point in the story of the alphabet, not because the letters themselves changed, but because how they were shared did. Before, each letter had been shaped by hand, painstakingly, lovingly, one stroke at a time. But now, those same letters could be cast in metal, arranged in rows, inked, and pressed onto paper again and again. The press did not make new letters. It simply made more of them, faster, cheaper, easier. And in that shift, The alphabet, still the same simple shapes that had once crossed the sea with Phoenician traders, spread like never before. Books that once took years to make could now be printed in weeks, then days. The letters leapt from parchment to paper, from script to type. Each page held dozens of lines, each line filled with the familiar curves of Latin letters, descended from Greek, rooted in Phoenician soil. In Germany, Gutenberg's Bible was printed using black-letter type, heavy and ornate. It was a marvel, dense with symbols, rich with meaning. But still, at its core, it was the same alphabet. In Italy, the typefaces became lighter, more graceful. Italic scripts inspired by handwriting, serifed fonts that echoed Roman inscriptions. Designers like Aldus Manutius and Claude Garamond began to shape the way letters looked, not their sound, but their form. The alphabet, once practical and plain, became beautiful, not just a tool, but an art. And as presses multiplied across Europe, the alphabet traveled with them, into marketplaces and churches, town squares and quiet studies, into pamphlets and proclamations, poems and plays. It carried revolution and reform, science and superstition, love and law. For the first time, a person in one country could read the exact words printed in another. The alphabet became a bridge not just between people, but across borders and time. Literacy rates rose. Schools opened, newspapers appeared. Letters became part of everyday life, not just for monks or scholars, but for merchants, artisans, even peasants. Children learned the alphabet not by copying from a chalkboard, but by reading printed primers, each page decorated with large, bold capitals and clear lowercase forms. The order of letters, A to Z, became fixed, familiar, even musical. The alphabet song may have come later, but the rhythm of the letters was already there, marching softly across pages in every book. And yet, through all this expansion, the alphabet remained quiet. It did not shout to be noticed. It simply worked. That was its genius. That was its legacy. It fit every tongue. It could be shaped into every voice: French, Spanish, English, Portuguese, Dutch. The letters bent to each language without breaking. And as European powers began to sail across oceans, settling and colonizing distant lands, the alphabet went with them. Printed Bibles, trade manifests, colonial decrees, school books, newspapers. In every port city, in every growing colony, the Latin alphabet appeared, not because it was better than other scripts, but because it had become the standard of power and print. And with power came permanence. But let us not forget its quiet beginnings. As the presses hummed and books multiplied, the letters themselves had not changed. A is still A. B is still B, the same bones, the same structure, the same thread stretching back over 3,000 years. From the scratched clay tablets of Phoenician scribes, to the chiseled stones of Greek temples, to the elegant pages of printed tomes in dusty European libraries. All of it, one unbroken line. In the next part, we will drift gently into the modern age, where the alphabet slips into machines, into wires, into screens, and eventually into the digital world we now know. But for now, let your thoughts rest in the soft clatter of a printing press turning slowly, the warm scent of ink in the air, the rustle of fresh pages stacked neatly in rows. Sleep in the knowledge that something so simple, so quiet, has lasted longer than kingdoms. And still, it speaks. By the time the 19th century arrived, the world was no longer lit only by candles or warmed by the breath of ancient fires. It hummed with new energy, steam, electricity, and the low, steady clatter of machines. And through all this, the alphabet, still unchanged in essence, continued its quiet work. It no longer needed to be set by hand in heavy trays of metal type. Mechanical typesetting emerged, allowing entire lines to be cast at once. Newspapers became daily rituals, spreading across cities like folded waves of information, their headlines bold, their type crisp. Books no longer belonged only to the wealthy. They lined the shelves of ordinary homes, modest schools, traveling libraries. And everywhere the same letters appeared. A through Z, the alphabet had become a constant, a quiet background to the noise of modern life. But even as the world turned louder, the letters kept their calm. They adapted again, this time to keys, first on typewriters, those heavy, clacking machines with round buttons and ribbon spools. Each key was a promise. A single tap left a mark, black or blue, on the pale page, and each mark was a letter. The same letters, again and again, pressed into paper like steady footsteps through time. Offices filled with typists, clerks, writers, journalists. The alphabet became not just a tool of learning, but of commerce, of bureaucracy, of industry. It helped build contracts, instructions, memos, speeches, novels. And then something even quieter arrived: the telegraph. Now messages could travel at the speed of wire. Letters, once tied to ships and saddlebags, now flew invisibly across great distances. A message written in London could be received in New York in minutes. The alphabet had become not just visual, but electrical. Dots and dashes in Morse code translated letters into sound, into pulses, into motion. And again, it adapted, quietly, faithfully, without needing to be rewritten. The invention of the telephone followed, and then the radio. With them came the voice, carried across the air. But even in those invisible conversations, the alphabet remained essential: spelled names, coordinates, passwords, instructions. And as the 20th century unfolded, the alphabet slipped into an entirely new space, one built of circuits, lights, and screens. The digital age had arrived, and with it came keyboards. From the typewriter's clack to the soft tap of early computer keys, the layout remained familiar: QWERTY, caps lock, shift, spacebar. And beneath every word typed, every line coded, every message sent, were those same 26 letters. The alphabet became the DNA of computers. It built websites, programs, emails. It shaped every URL, every login, every search. And once again, the letters did not resist. They did not age. They simply served. From glowing monitors to blinking cursors, they became the quiet language of the future. And yet, even now, they hold the same power they did when carved into Phoenician wood. A letter is still a sound. A sound is still a symbol still a bridge between one mind and another. In every message you send, every note you write, every name you type into your phone, the alphabet is there, invisible but faithful. In social media posts and digital books, in online maps and chat boxes. It is the silent structure beneath our noisy, glowing world. And as artificial intelligence and digital voices rise to meet us, they too are built on the same skeleton. Trained to read, to write, to understand, all through letters first shaped thousands of years ago on sun-warmed docks by hands now long gone. In the next part, we will explore the alphabet as it exists now, in this very moment, how it lives in our daily habits, our communications, our memories. But for now, let your breathing slow. Let your thoughts drift gently, like soft code passing through the invisible channels. Imagine the alphabet, floating in a quiet stream of ones and zeros, still doing what it always has: connecting, remembering, recording. Close your eyes. The letters will still be here in the morning. Now here we are, in the present moment, surrounded by letters, everywhere. On your screen, in your pocket, on signs and receipts, menus and messages. The alphabet has become so familiar, so ever-present, that we almost forget it's there. Like the rhythm of a clock ticking quietly in the background, like the gentle hum of a refrigerator, always working, always steady. The alphabet no longer belongs only to scribes or scholars, to traders or teachers. It belongs to everyone. It hums beneath the surface of daily life. You see it in your notifications. You hear it in text-to-speech. You type it to search for a dinner recipe, or to say goodnight to someone far away. And yet, despite all the change that surrounds us, technology, speed, complexity, the alphabet remains astonishingly simple. Just 26 letters, lined in a row, from A to Z, nothing more, nothing less. And within those 26 symbols, everything you've ever read or written has taken shape. Novels and notes, contracts and captions, whispered promises and printed headlines. The alphabet doesn't care whether it's carved in stone or glowing on a touchscreen. Its shapes remain. A is still A, E is still E. They do not age, they do not fade. They simply serve. In quiet, consistent rhythm, in every moment of modern life. Think of your day, how it begins with an alarm clock glowing with numbers and maybe a short message, a reminder, or a date. Then you check your phone. Notifications blink. Messages await. Social media scrolls past in a flurry of letters arranged into comments, updates, ideas. At work or school, more letters wait. Emails, forms, instructions, calendars. You respond, you write, you type. And the alphabet responds without complaint. It does not judge your grammar or spelling. It does not resist your accent or your typing speed. It simply offers the same set of tools, again and again, quiet, consistent, kind. And in the evening, perhaps, you unwind with a book, or a show with subtitles flickering at the bottom, or a podcast whose script was once just a quiet page of text. And again, the alphabet is there, softly holding the structure of what you read, hear, and understand. It has never needed attention. It does not shout for recognition. And yet it holds the weight of memory, of knowledge, of culture itself. Every diary ever kept, every recipe ever shared, every journal entry, every textbook, every love letter. The alphabet is the quiet spine of all of it. And even in the future, as the world shifts again toward voice, toward gesture, toward thought itself as input, the alphabet will likely remain. Perhaps hidden, perhaps transformed, but always there. Because even when machines speak for us or learn from us, they must still be taught. And the alphabet is the foundation of that teaching. It offers shape to thought, form to feeling, order to chaos. And maybe that is its greatest gift, not just the ability to communicate, but the ability to understand. A child tracing the letter M for mother, a young adult writing their first resume, an elderly person typing a note to a grandchild. Across time, space, language, and experience, the alphabet unites, not by force, not by power, but by presence, constant, enduring, gentle. In the next part, we'll take a moment to reflect on how deeply this alphabet has shaped human identity. Not just communication, but connection. What it means to write, to be read, to leave a mark. But for now, let your mind drift. Let the letters fade softly into the quiet of night. They will return in the morning, ready to serve again, just as they always have, and always will. When we pause to consider what it means to be human, we often speak of love, of memory, of creativity, of dreams. But beneath all of those things, beneath our ability to reflect, to imagine, to hope, there is another layer, a quieter one. It is our ability to record, to give shape to our thoughts, to take the invisible cloud of ideas inside of our minds and place them, gently, outside ourselves, in a form that another person can receive. The alphabet made this possible. It gave us a means of transmission, not through sound alone, not through gesture or image, but through symbols. Tiny, repeatable, reliable symbols. We do not often think of how extraordinary that is. We speak and write every day, as if it were natural, as if language always existed in written form, but it didn't. It was carved, letter by letter, into the world we now take for granted. And it all began with someone deciding that a single sound, a puff of air, a curve of the tongue, deserved its own mark. The mark for B, the mark for M, the mark for S. The alphabet became a net we could cast into the ocean of sound and retrieve it, hold it, share it. It gave permanence to the fleeting. And that changed everything. Once, if you told a story, it had to be remembered, passed along by word of mouth, retold again and again, vulnerable to forgetfulness, to change, to silence. But with writing and with the alphabet, stories no longer needed to be repeated. They could be preserved, not just for a day or a week, but for years, centuries, millennia. That is how you are able to hear this story now, not because someone remembered it, but because someone wrote it down. When you open a book, you are hearing the voice of a person long gone, not their voice in the air, but their voice in the page. And the alphabet is the quiet structure that carries it. It holds the soul of every word. Every letter becomes a breath made solid. This gift, the ability to be understood by someone you will never meet, is one of the most profound aspects of being alive. It is why letters matter, why writing matters, and why the alphabet, simple as it is, sits at the center of it all. Consider how many people have used the alphabet before you. The child scratching their name into bark with a stone. The prisoner writing a final note on a scrap of cloth. The poet, candlelit, scribbling verses into a notebook. The parent writing a bedtime story, the scientist publishing a theory, the activist crafting a speech. All of them, different hearts, different dreams, different lifetimes, using the same letters, the same humble tools over and over again. And the letters never resisted. They never aged. They never grew tired. They waited, and they served, quietly, faithfully, without complaint. You too are part of this lineage. Every time you write a message, fill out a form, type a name, make a list, you are participating in a tradition that began thousands of years ago. You are not separate from history. You are its continuation. And though the world has changed in countless ways, through war, through invention, through transformation, the alphabet has not needed to be replaced. It still works, it still connects, it still endures. In the next part, we'll explore how the alphabet shapes identity, not just for nations or languages, but for individuals. How we find our names, our voices, our presence through the arrangement of these quiet, enduring letters. But for now, let yourself rest. Let the quiet repetition of symbols drift away from your mind like smoke in still air. Let your body soften, your breath slow. The alphabet will be here when you wake, ready to carry your words, your thoughts, your gentle voice, wherever you need them to go. Now let us drift gently into the idea of identity, how something as small and quiet as the alphabet has shaped who we are, not just as a species, but as individuals. It starts early. Even before we fully understand what letters are, we are introduced to them through our names. A soft E for Emily, a rounded O for Oliver, a sharp K for Kai. The letters become I. They shape the first symbols we learn to recognize. A child learning to spell their name feels a thrill, not because they know the alphabet's long history, but because suddenly, a part of the world now belongs to them. Their name exists not only in sound but in form, in curves and lines that they can draw, that others can read. It is the beginning of written identity, and it stays with us. Throughout life, we continue to use those letters not only to write, but to define ourselves. Our initials, our signatures, our usernames and passwords. Each one a quiet arrangement of familiar shapes that says, "This is me." And beyond the individual, the alphabet holds our collective memory. It defines languages, cultures, histories. The shape of an R in Russian, the curve of an S in Spanish, the accent above an A in French. Each language takes the alphabet and bends it slightly, softly, like light through glass. But the structure remains, universal, recognizable. Beneath those tiny variations is a shared framework, a deep silent agreement that these shapes carry sound, and that sound carries meaning, and that meaning binds us. And so, through these letters, we are both different and the same. Your words might be unique, your thoughts your own, but the tools you use, the alphabet, have been held by millions, and that is what makes it so quietly powerful. It is deeply personal, and yet entirely communal. A handwritten note, a typed text, a carved name on a park bench, all speak through the same medium. Whether it is a child writing "I love you" in shaky pencil, or a scientist publishing a paper in a journal, the alphabet is the bridge between thought and presence. It gives shape to what would otherwise be fleeting, and even more than that, it gives us permission to exist beyond our bodies. You may never meet the person reading your words, but through letters, they can know you, hear your voice, feel your presence. The alphabet allows us to extend ourselves through time and space, across pages, across screens, across centuries. And because of this, it has become one of the most democratic inventions in human history. No longer reserved for kings or scholars, letters are now in the hands of everyone: the artist, the farmer, the student, the dreamer. They are tools of power, yes, but also of peace, of memory, of quiet expression. They allow us to write to the future, to leave messages for those not yet born, to echo our thoughts beyond our breath. In this way, the alphabet is not just a system, it is a sanctuary, a safe place to place your thoughts, a home for your hopes, and perhaps that is why it endures. Not because it is flawless, but because it is familiar, forgiving, loyal. In the next part, we'll bring our journey toward its final reflections, thinking about what it means to carry something so ancient into a future still unknown. But for now, lie still. Let your own name echo quietly in your mind, the way the letters line up, the way they sound together, the way they hold you. Let sleep come, letter by letter, soft as snow on a windowsill. The alphabet is watching over you, just as it always has, and it always will. And now, as we reach the end of this quiet journey, we return to the beginning, not with loud conclusions or flashing discoveries, but with stillness, with wonder, and with deep, quiet gratitude. The alphabet, after all, has never demanded applause. It has never shouted its own name, and yet it has followed us through time, through rising empires and crumbling kingdoms, through candlelit monasteries and humming data centers, through hand-carved clay and blinking screens. From Phoenician traders gliding across the sea to digital messages whispered across the internet, the alphabet has been there, invisible but essential, soft yet indestructible. It has held our names, our stories, our questions, our hopes. It has recorded our beginnings, our mistakes, our promises. It has allowed us to speak not only to one another, but to ourselves. In notebooks, in poems, in late-night thoughts typed quickly and saved quietly. And still, for all its weight in our lives, it is made of nothing but curves and lines. 26 humble shapes, that's all. And yet from those shapes, we have built worlds. We've created languages that soar and stumble, arguments that rage and resolve, lullabies that hush and comfort. We've written laws and letters, histories, and how-to manuals, novels and notes passed in class, all from the same simple forms. There is a kind of magic in that. Not the kind of magic that dazzles or astonishes, but the kind that hums gently in the background of everything, like the way your breath keeps moving without needing to be told, or the way the stars are still shining. Even when the clouds block your view, the alphabet is not loud. It does not insist, but it endures. It endures because it is useful, because it is simple, because it does not belong to any one person or time or place. It belongs to us all. It is shared freely, again and again, without condition. You don't need to earn it. You don't need to be perfect to use it. You simply need a thought and a place to begin. A letter, then another, then a word, and just like that, you're part of something ancient, something enormous, something quiet. The Phoenicians could not have known how far their idea would travel. They could not have seen the alphabets etched on modern street signs, glowing on phones, projected in classrooms, stitched into logos, printed onto paperbacks lined up on bookshelves. But maybe that's the beauty of it. They didn't need to see it, they just needed to share it. And we too do the same. Every time you write a message, leave a note, type a post, or sign your name, you are continuing a legacy. Not a grand one perhaps, but a gentle one, a meaningful one, a human one. The alphabet connects us, not just to one another, but to everyone who came before, and to everyone who will come after. It is a thread in the fabric of time. And as we close our eyes tonight, as we let this story fade into the soft quiet of sleep, we are not letting it go. We are carrying it forward in the words we choose tomorrow, in the way we listen, in the way we write, in the way we pause to notice the letters all around us, quietly doing their work. So now let yourself drift. Let the alphabet fade into the dark like soft footprints in the snow. You are safe. You are held. You are surrounded by something ancient and kind. Sleep well, dear listener. The letters will still be here when you wake, ready as always to begin again. That's the end of our quiet journey through the story of the alphabet. Before we drift into our next tale, if this helped you rest, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. It means a lot, and it helps keep these peaceful stories flowing night after night. Now, let us gently move forward to the next chapter in our slow, sleepy series, What the Etruscans Taught the Romans. Close your eyes. Let the past unfold softly once more. Long before the Roman Empire built its marble temples, marched legions across continents, and etched its laws into the stone of history, there was a quieter people, less remembered, less celebrated, but essential to what Rome would become. They lived in the hills and valleys of central Italy, in well-organized cities shaded by olive groves and cypress trees. They were the Etruscans. And though the echoes of their voices are faint now, their influence still lingers, tucked quietly beneath the surface of Roman life. The Etruscans were not a single city, but a network of city-states, independent yet connected, each with its own ruler, its own customs, but sharing a common language and worldview. Their cities bore names like Veii, Tarquinia, and Clusium, and their people were skilled in metalwork, art, divination, and architecture. They did not build grand empires or leave behind sweeping conquests. Instead, they built slowly, thoughtfully, elegantly. Their temples rose with high podiums and deep porches. Their streets followed deliberate plans. Their tombs were decorated with scenes of music, dancing, and feasting, suggesting a culture that valued joy, ritual, and memory. The Romans, in their earliest days, were just a small group of settlers on the banks of the Tiber River, a few huts, a few fields, no glory, no grandeur. But they lived close to the Etruscans, close enough to learn, close enough to borrow, and borrow they did, quietly, systematically. The Etruscans gave the Romans more than just influence. They gave them foundations. The Romans adopted the Etruscan toga, originally a ceremonial garment, and made it a symbol of Roman citizenship. They borrowed the layout of the Etruscan temple, with its triple cella and frontal steps, and used it to build their own places of worship. Even the word person in Latin, persona, comes from the Etruscan word for a theatrical mask, a reminder that identity itself, in Roman thought, was shaped in part by Etruscan culture. And religion was perhaps the deepest influence of all. The Etruscans believed in signs, in omens, in the messages carried by birds and lightning. They practiced a complex form of divination called haruspicy, in which priests interpreted the will of the gods by studying the livers of sacrificed animals. The Romans absorbed this system and built entire priesthoods around it. The haruspices became respected interpreters of fate. Roman generals would consult them before battles. Senators would await their readings before making decisions. It was not mere superstition, it was statecraft. Through the Etruscans, Rome learned that power required ritual. That ceremony shaped belief. That belief shaped action. Even their political structure bore traces of Etruscan design. Early Roman kings, such as Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus, were themselves Etruscan, or heavily influenced by Etruscan customs. Their symbols of authority, the fasces, a bundle of rods bound around an axe, were taken directly from Etruscan ritual, later becoming a Roman emblem of magistrate power. The Etruscans, though eventually absorbed by Rome, never truly disappeared. Their practices, their architecture, their silent contributions became part of the Roman DNA. And so, while the Roman Republic would one day shout across the world with its armies, its laws, and its emperors, the Etruscans whispered into its roots. They taught Rome how to build, how to pray, how to govern, not through conquest, but through quiet influence, through example, through time. In the next part, we'll walk deeper into Etruscan life, into their homes, their beliefs, their art, and see how a civilization that left behind no empire still managed to shape one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. But for now, let your thoughts rest in the soft hills of ancient Italy. Let the names of old cities drift like mist across your mind. Veii, Tarquinia, Clusium, forgotten, but never lost. Sleep well, the Etruscans are still with us. To understand what the Etruscans truly gave the Romans, we must step gently into their world, not just as a distant people from the past, but as a living culture, rich in detail, steady in rhythm, and quietly confident in its ways. The Etruscans built their cities on high ground, often surrounded by walls of volcanic stone, overlooking fertile plains. Their homes, though modest at first, grew more refined over time, with tiled roofs, columned courtyards, and intricate floor mosaics. They had a deep sense of order, of symmetry, of balance. Their cities were not chaotic or improvised. They followed careful urban planning, with main roads aligned to celestial signs, neighborhoods arranged by function, temples placed with purpose. This respect for structure was something the Romans would later adopt, not only in architecture, but in how they thought about society itself. The Etruscans saw harmony in design, and the Romans would later see power in that harmony. Inside the Etruscan home, life unfolded with grace. Families gathered in central atriums, meals were shared, stories told. Women in Etruscan society held a more visible role than in many ancient cultures. They dined with men, attended public events, and were often commemorated in tomb inscriptions with names and achievements. This visibility, while later softened in Roman times, left an impression. It hinted at a society where dignity was not limited to one gender, where presence mattered, and where memory was shared. Etruscan art reflected this. In painted tombs, we see women reclining beside men at banquets, holding cups of wine, listening to music. Not as silent observers, but as participants. And music, too, played a role in their world. Lyres, flutes, drums, sounds that carried through ceremonies, rituals, and daily life. Their sculptures, especially in terracotta, had a softness to them, a quiet smile, a gentle turn of the head. Not stern or heroic like later Roman statues, but warm, human, personal. The Etruscans were not obsessed with grandeur. They were drawn to meaning, to beauty, to ritual. And nowhere was that more evident than in their burial practices. The Etruscans believed in an afterlife, not as an abstract hope, but as a real continuation of life's pleasures and purposes. Their tombs were not just places to bury the dead, but to honor them. Underground chambers carved from rock, painted with scenes of feasting, dancing, games, and gentle farewells. These tombs were often designed like homes, with beds, doors, and symbolic windows, spaces that suggested comfort, continuity, presence. The Romans saw this reverence for the dead, and they too began to build tombs that told stories, to carve inscriptions that recorded names, virtues, and lineages. Etruscan reverence became Roman tradition. The afterlife became architecture. But the Etruscans also believed in boundaries, between life and death, between sacred and ordinary. Their priests were trained in interpreting the will of the gods through rituals known only to the initiated. They read the sky, the flight of birds, the crack of thunder. They studied the entrails of sacrificed animals. This practice, odd to us now, was to them a form of communication, a way of listening to the divine. The Romans, always practical, took this practice and formalized it. They created priesthoods, public rituals, festivals. The sacred became part of state business. And so the Etruscan way, subtle, symbolic, ceremonial, became embedded in Roman thought, not as a copy but as a foundation, as something remembered, reshaped, and retold. In the next part, we will explore how Etruscan engineering, city planning, and artistic sensibility laid the groundwork for Roman infrastructure, from aqueducts to arches. But for now, let yourself wander slowly through an ancient necropolis, where carved stones line quiet paths, and the wind carries the memory of a people who built not for fame, but for meaning. Let your thoughts rest beside theirs, in silence, in respect, in peace. As the Etruscan world unfolded quietly across the central hills of ancient Italy, its achievements in architecture and engineering began to speak for themselves, not through grand proclamations or marble manifestos, but through stone, water, and the thoughtful shaping of space. Long before Rome was known for its roads and aqueducts, the Etruscans were laying the foundations for infrastructure that would later carry the empire. They understood the land intimately, its curves and slopes, its underground waters and hidden resources, and they used that understanding to guide their designs. They were among the first in the region to master the use of the arch, not in theory, but in practice. The Etruscan arch, shaped from wedge-shaped stones called voussoirs, became the core of their bridges, gates, and tombs. These arches did not shout, they held, quietly, firmly, with grace. The Romans, watching and learning, would later take this concept and magnify it, building vast aqueducts, colosseums, and triumphal arches. But the form, the principle, the strength came from Etruria. The Etruscans also dug tunnels, known as cuniculae, to drain marshes and irrigate farmland. These underground passages, often narrow and carefully sloped, allowed water to flow where it was needed most. The Romans adopted this technique, and in time, it would grow into an empire-wide system of hydraulic engineering. But the core idea, using the land's own quiet pathways to serve the people, was Etruscan. Their cities were built with intention. Walls followed the contours of the hills, streets aligned with the sun, temples faced celestial markers, and beneath the streets, early sewer systems guided water away from homes and toward designated drainage points. Rome's Cloaca Maxima, one of the oldest and most important sewers in the ancient world, was influenced directly by these early Etruscan models. It began as a means of draining the marshland between the hills of early Rome, a practice the Etruscans had already perfected. Even the very organization of Roman public space, the forum, the temple platform, the central road, echoed earlier Etruscan layouts, not copied exactly, but remembered, adapted, improved perhaps, but always in quiet tribute to what came before. Artistic sensibility played a part too. The Etruscans did not separate utility from beauty. A well-built wall was also a canvas. A water basin could be shaped like an animal or a god. Even their pottery, crafted with care, bore symmetrical designs and gentle curves. Form and function danced together in balance. This sense of elegance in the everyday became a hallmark of Roman design. As Rome grew, it would continue to emphasize symmetry, proportion, and symbolism. But at its root, this came not only from Greek inspiration, as is often told, but from the Etruscans who came before the Greeks ever touched Roman soil. And perhaps one of the most subtle lessons the Etruscans passed to the Romans was how to build for time. Their structures were not rushed. Their cities were layered. They understood that true permanence required patience. That stone, properly placed, could outlast empires. The Romans absorbed this mindset deeply. They did not simply build for function, they built for legacy. And so, as aqueducts carried water across valleys and roads stretched across continents, the whisper of Etruscan engineering remained beneath every arch, every stone, every calculation. In the next part, we will explore how the Etruscans shaped the rituals of war, the symbols of state, and the visual language of Roman authority, from the curve of a helmet to the ceremonial march of power. But for now, let your thoughts rest beneath the ancient archways. Let your breath follow the slow movement of water through a stone tunnel. Let sleep come gently, like the careful placement of brick upon brick, in a city meant to last forever. As we continue to drift deeper into the legacy of the Etruscans, we begin to see not just the homes they built or the temples they raised, but the systems of meaning they passed on, symbols, gestures, rituals, and practices that would shape the very soul of Roman identity. Power for the Etruscans was not a loud declaration. It was something expressed in form, in dress, in movement. Their leaders, called lucumones, did not just rule. They embodied authority. Their appearance, their ceremonies, their tools of office, all spoke with a quiet language that Rome would later adopt and refine. One of the most enduring Etruscan contributions to Roman public life was the use of the fasces, a bundle of wooden rods tied around an axe. It was a simple object, carried by attendants called lictors, but its symbolism ran deep. The rods represented unity, strength through community. The axe signified the right to punish. Together, they spoke of order, discipline, and justice. The Romans adopted this emblem without change, and for centuries, it would be carried before consuls, magistrates, and even emperors. It appeared on coins, on reliefs, in sculptures, always quiet, always steady, a symbol not of cruelty, but of structure, of balance between authority and restraint. Military ritual, too, bore Etruscan fingerprints. The practice of triumph, where a victorious general paraded through the city in celebration, dressed in a purple robe and crowned with a laurel wreath, was first rooted in Etruscan royal ceremonies. The chariot, the music, the spectators, the presence of a slave whispering, "Remember, you are mortal," to the honored general. All these elements reflected a deep understanding of how public power should be shown. With grandeur, yes, but also with humility. With drama, but also with a reminder of the temporary nature of victory. Roman military dress itself was shaped by Etruscan design, helmets with curled cheek guards, breastplates molded to the body, sandals that laced up the leg. Each piece was not just armor, but iconography, each curve and line a message. Even the practice of augury, the reading of omens through the flight of birds, was inherited directly from the Etruscans. They believed the sky was divided into sacred zones, and that birds, as messengers of the gods, revealed divine will through their movement. Augurs, trained in this discipline, would stand on high places with a staff and mark the sky, interpreting the signs to guide decisions of war, peace, and governance. Rome adopted the practice completely. No major public act, founding a colony, electing a consul, declaring war, would be carried out without consultation of the augurs. Their readings were not just symbolic, they were binding. This was not mere mysticism, it was law, it was structure, and it was Etruscan. Even the Roman calendar bore marks of Etruscan influence. The division of time into days marked as favorable or unfavorable, the naming of certain months, the practice of declaring dies fasti, days on which legal business could be conducted, stemmed from Etruscan ritual structuring of time. Order extended not only into space, but into the hours themselves. The Etruscans taught the Romans that the world was not random. That meaning could be found in patterns, in symbols, in repetition. And so Rome, in its rise, became not just a power of armies and roads, but of ritual and symbolism. A civilization that carried meaning in everything, from the arch of a gate to the direction of a bird's flight. In the next part, we will trace how the Etruscan love of art and performance echoed through Roman entertainment, public space, and daily pleasure. But for now, let your thoughts march slowly, like a triumphal procession through a quiet city. Let the rhythms of ancient ritual become the rhythm of your breathing. Let sleep arrive in silence, draped in purple, crowned with olive, welcomed with peace. As the stars turned slowly above the hills of ancient Etruria, and soft music floated from courtyards lit by oil lamps, the Etruscans turned not only to ritual and architecture, but to something more playful, more human, art and entertainment. While their neighbors in early Rome were still shaping their identity, the Etruscans had already filled their days with song, sport, theater, and beauty. They celebrated life not just through survival, but through enjoyment. And this spirit of delight, measured, ritualized, yet joyful, would become one of the most lasting gifts they passed to the Romans. Etruscan art was full of motion. In painted tombs, we see dancers mid-step, their feet lifted, their arms curved, their faces serene. We see musicians playing lyres and flutes, athletes wrestling or running, couples reclining at banquets with cups raised and smiles caught forever in the brushstrokes of long-dead painters. These images were not created to impress the living. They were painted in the tombs, as gifts for the dead. The Etruscans believed that joy belonged in the afterlife. That celebration was not something to be left behind, but carried forward. The Romans would later adopt this sense of festive legacy, carving scenes of public games, feasts, and gladiatorial events into their walls and monuments. But the tone was already set. The love of performance, of spectacle, of communal pleasure, it began with the Etruscans. One of the most visible legacies lies in the theater. The Etruscans were known for stage performances, religious dramas, and masked dances. The word person, as we mentioned earlier, comes from the Etruscan word for a mask, used in performance. The Romans took this concept and built entire theaters, curved seating, stone stages, elaborate acoustics. But the soul of the performance, the art of embodying a role, of telling a story through posture, voice, and expression, was deeply Etruscan. The masks, the movements, the sense of presence, they all came from that older culture just north of the Tiber. Gladiatorial combat, though later infamous as a Roman institution, likely began as an Etruscan funeral rite. It was believed that such contests honored the dead, perhaps even provided spiritual offerings to the afterlife. Two men armed would fight not for sport, but as part of a sacred farewell. Over time, the Romans transformed this ritual into public entertainment, held in amphitheaters for tens of thousands, but the original seed was solemn, sacred, meaningful. The Etruscans did not seek blood for its own sake. They sought significance in every action. And in their public spaces, we find more signs of this love for shared experience. Marketplaces arranged with aesthetic care, public fountains adorned with carved figures, even simple household items, mirrors, cups, combs, were shaped with artistry. Beauty was not reserved for the elite. It flowed through everyday life. And so when Rome began to build its own public spaces, its forums, its theaters, its circuses, it was not creating from nothing. It was building upon a foundation already set in motion by Etruscan hands: the placement of the stage, the order of the seating, the ceremonial openings. The very idea that entertainment could be a civic ritual was inherited, quietly, thoroughly, without need for credit. Even Roman sculpture, while later associated with Greek realism, first found its footing in Etruscan clay and bronze. Busts of ancestors, figures of gods, funerary urns shaped like seated men holding scrolls. These works were not cold or distant. They were personal, expressive, filled with quiet character. In the next part, we'll follow the decline of Etruscan independence and how Rome slowly absorbed, then eclipsed, this culture it had learned so much from. But for now, let your thoughts dance slowly through a painted tomb where music never stops and everyone is smiling. Let your breath match the rhythm of a gentle flute. Let sleep arrive as softly as a curtain rising before a quiet performance, timeless, tender, and full of presence. As we continue this quiet journey through time, we now begin to feel the subtle shift, the moment when the Etruscans, once steady and influential, began to fade beneath the growing shadow of a new and rising power, Rome. It didn't happen all at once. There was no single battle, no grand declaration, no sudden fall. Instead, it was like a tide, slow, persistent, and irreversible. The Etruscans, who had once taught Rome how to build, worship, govern, and celebrate, would in time become absorbed by the very civilization they had helped shape. In the early days, the balance between the Etruscans and the Romans was uncertain. Rome itself, according to tradition, had Etruscan kings, especially Tarquinius Priscus and Tarquinius Superbus, figures remembered with a mixture of admiration and fear. These monarchs brought engineering, religious structure, and cultural refinement. But their rule also came with a sense of foreign control, of aristocracy and hierarchy that clashed with emerging Roman values. When the Roman monarchy was overthrown at the end of the 6th century BCE, it was not merely a rebellion against tyranny, it was also a quiet rejection of Etruscan political dominance. And so the Roman Republic was born, not in isolation, but in contrast. Even so, the Etruscans remained nearby. Their cities such as Veii, Tarquinia, and Volci still flourished. Their trade networks still stretched across the sea. Their priests still read the skies. But Rome was growing, militarily, economically, and politically. And as Rome expanded, it turned its attention to the lands of its teachers. Veii, just 12 miles from Rome, became the first great target. The war for Veii was not brief. It lasted for years, an exhausting siege that culminated in the city's fall around 396 BCE. The Roman general, Marcus Furius Camillus, often likened to a second founder of Rome, led the final assault. And with Veii's fall, the slow unweaving of Etruscan independence began. Other cities followed, each absorbed into the Roman system, not necessarily destroyed, but restructured. Their walls remained. Their temples were sometimes preserved. Their people were often granted partial citizenship. But the rhythm of life began to change. Latin replaced Etruscan. Roman law replaced local custom. The ceremonies continued, but their meanings softened. Their language, a unique non-Indo-European tongue with no known close relatives, gradually fell silent. By the 1st century BCE, few Etruscans still spoke it. By the early empire, it was nearly gone. But the loss was not loud. It was slow, like a candle burning down in a quiet room. Still, traces remained. Roman families proudly traced their lineage to Etruscan nobility. Roman architects continued to echo Etruscan foundations. Roman priests still practiced divination rooted in Etruscan rites, and some Roman thinkers, such as Varro and Livy, wrote about the Etruscans with a tone of nostalgia, as if they knew something precious had been lost, even as the Republic and later the Empire continued to rise. This quiet absorption of the Etruscans into Rome is unlike many other stories of conquest. It was not a story of destruction, but of fading influence, of a teacher whose student outgrew them, of a culture that, rather than being erased, was slowly folded into something larger. It is a story with no clear ending, only echoes. And perhaps that is why it still lingers. In the next part, we will explore how the memory of the Etruscans endured long after their names and cities had faded from maps. Through mythology, through archaeology, through fragments carefully pieced together by later generations. But for now, rest with the thought that not all legacies are loud. Some are soft, some are patient. Some are carried not in monuments or victories, but in quiet influence that survives through those who remember. Let your breath fall into that same rhythm, slow, steady, peaceful. The Etruscans may be gone, but their story has not ended. It continues, with you. Though the Etruscans slowly faded from political relevance, their memory was never fully lost. It lingered in the margins of Roman literature, in temple foundations buried beneath newer cities, and in customs so deeply woven into Roman identity that most never noticed where they began. As the Roman Empire expanded, dominating Europe, North Africa, and the Near East, it carried with it not just its own customs, but the silent legacy of the people it had absorbed. The Etruscans became a people of the past, spoken of in the way old myths are remembered, but traces remained, quiet and persistent. Roman authors, particularly during the late Republic and early Empire, sometimes looked back to the Etruscans with curiosity, reverence, even melancholy. Writers like Livy and Varro referenced Etruscan practices in their histories. They recognized the rituals that had shaped Rome's earliest days, even if they did not fully understand them. The language, by then, was no longer spoken, but it still appeared in inscriptions, on mirrors, on pottery, on tombs. Strange and elegant, the letters curved and curled in ways that suggested depth and intention. Though Rome no longer spoke the Etruscan tongue, it still carried its symbols, its structures, its echoes. Roman religion, so deeply structured and formal, continued to be infused with Etruscan logic. The haruspices, those priests trained in the interpretation of omens through animal entrails, were still consulted in the Roman Senate well into the imperial period. Even the position of augur, the official who read the flight of birds to determine divine favor, had roots in Etruscan divination. These practices became so embedded in Roman statecraft that they were seen as Roman, even when their origins lay elsewhere. Architecture also whispered of the past. Beneath grand Roman forums lay Etruscan stonework. Beneath sweeping basilicas, old temple platforms, Rome built upward, but not without the foundations that had come before. The triple tela of Roman temples, their frontal orientation, and even the use of the Tuscan order in columns were all inspired by the temples of Etruria. The aesthetic had shifted, but the bones were Etruscan. Artifacts surfaced over time. Bronze mirrors with engraved scenes, funerary urns shaped like reclining figures, gold jewelry bearing strange inscriptions. Each piece told a story, not of dominance or empire, but of daily life, of belief, of memory. These objects did not shout. They invited. They asked questions in silence. Who were these people? What did they believe? How did they see the world? And slowly, over centuries, scholars, archaeologists, and linguists began to listen. In the Renaissance, humanists rediscovered Etruscan tombs and temples, buried under earth and time. In the modern era, excavations revealed entire necropolises, cities of the dead that hinted at the lives once lived above. Tarquinia, Cerveteri, Vulci, names that had once faded from maps, returned to the conversation. The Etruscans were no longer just shadows beneath Roman stone. They were individuals with families, traditions, dreams. Though their language remains largely undeciphered, their presence is unmistakable. Museums today hold their treasures. Scholars continue to study their texts. And the land itself remembers, the hills of Tuscany and Lazio, still dotted with ancient ruins, still carrying the rhythm of a culture that never truly disappeared. What the Etruscans taught the Romans was not a lesson with a beginning and an end. It was a stream of influence, quiet and constant. It shaped how Rome ruled, how it prayed, how it built, how it thought. And in this way, the Etruscans live on, not as a conquered people, but as silent architects of empire. In the next part, we will reflect on how modern Italy and the wider world continue to engage with this forgotten culture, and how their soft legacy endures, not in monuments, but in mystery. But for now, let your mind rest gently in the in-between, between past and present, between memory and dream, between the silence of forgotten languages and the echo of footsteps on ancient stone. The Etruscans are still here, and so are you. In the quiet stillness of the modern world, far removed from the smoky hearths and painted tombs of ancient Etruria, there remains a peculiar kind of presence, a hum beneath the noise, a faint shape beneath the stone. The Etruscans, though long gone as a people, continue to leave their mark in ways both visible and unseen. Walk through the landscapes of Tuscany and northern Lazio, and their memory rises with the hills, the soft roll of the countryside, the curves of the roads, the way the towns perch on high ridges. It is not accidental. It is inherited. The Etruscans chose those heights not for defense alone, but for connection, to sky, to wind, to the unseen. Today, many of these towns still sit where Etruscan cities once stood. Modern streets follow ancient outlines. Vineyards grow in soils once tilled by Etruscan hands. Beneath shop floors and cellars, beneath churches and cafes, lie buried tombs, stairways, chambers. history does not vanish, it layers. And in Italy, the Etruscan layer is one you can still feel. Archaeologists have worked for centuries to uncover that layer. In Tarquinia, vivid tomb paintings show scenes of life that remain as fresh as wet paint. Dancers swirl, musicians play, banquet guests recline with cups in hand, still toasting a moment that passed 2,000 years ago. In Cerveteri, entire necropolises mimic city streets. The dead were given houses carved in stone, with doors and beds and symbolic windows. These were not graves of grief, but places of passage, designed with care, designed to be remembered. And yet, for all that has been uncovered, much remains unknown. The Etruscan language, despite hundreds of inscriptions, remains only partially understood. It uses a modified Greek alphabet, but the meanings of many words are elusive. It's as if the Etruscans left us a diary, but wrote it in a dialect we can only guess at. And perhaps, in that mystery, there is a kind of protection, a kind of sacred distance. Not everything from the past must be decoded. Some things are meant to remain as whispers. The Romans inherited so much from the Etruscans: rituals, architecture, symbols, and practices. But they did not preserve the language. Latin grew strong, Etruscan faded. But silence is not the same as absence. Today, scholars piece together what they can. Historians read Roman texts for clues. Linguists study the structure of the Etruscan tongue. Artists find inspiration in its lines and forms. Tourists walk the pathways of Etruscan cities without always knowing whose footsteps they echo. And yet, the connection is there. It's in the curvature of an arch, in the layout of a forum, in the solemnity of a ritual performed without quite knowing why. It's in the instinct to carve meaning into stone, the desire to be remembered, the understanding that the soul is not measured in monuments alone, but in presence, in influence, in the long shadow cast by gentle light. Even in modern governance, the fasces, once a symbol of Etruscan and Roman authority, appears quietly on official seals and buildings, a visual echo of power wrapped in tradition. Even in modern theater, the idea of the persona still guides the art of performance. Even in everyday speech, the legacy of names, of roots, of rhythm persists. The Etruscans are gone, but they are not erased. They exist in the pause between languages, in the silence beneath architecture, in the overlooked corners of great civilizations. And perhaps that is the true measure of their gift, not only in what they built or believed, but in how deeply they trusted that meaning could outlast memory. In the next part, we'll reflect on what the Etruscan story means for us today, how the quiet cultures of history still shape our thoughts, our values, and our futures, even if we do not always know their names. But for now, allow yourself to rest, to breathe, to imagine a world where meaning lives in shadows and history speaks in soft tones. The Etruscans are no longer here to tell their story, but somehow it is still being told. As the night deepens and the past stretches out like a quiet landscape behind us, we are left with something soft and essential, a sense that the Etruscan story is not just a fragment of history, but a mirror not of conquest or fame, but of what it means to leave behind traces that shape others, even after one's own voice has grown quiet. In a world often obsessed with power and permanence, the Etruscans remind us that influence can be subtle, quiet, almost invisible. They remind us that to shape the world, you do not need to conquer it. You only need to participate in it with meaning. And through their participation, through their slow and thoughtful crafting of life, the Etruscans gave Rome the materials it would use to build something far larger than itself. But what they gave was not only physical. It was not just temples and arches, rituals and symbols. It was a philosophy of balance. The Etruscans saw life and death as parts of a continuum, not opposites but companions. Their tombs were not made to frighten but to comfort. Their rituals were not meant to control but to harmonize. They lived in conversation with the land, with the seasons, with the sky. And they believed that meaning could be found in the patterns of birds, the shape of a liver, the color of a flame. To modern ears, these practices may sound distant, even strange, but beneath them is a familiar impulse, the desire to understand the world, to read its signs, to move with it rather than against it. This is what the Etruscans gave to Rome, and what Rome carried forward to the world, a structure not only of stone, but of thought. The Roman Republic and later the Roman Empire would become known for law, for architecture, for the organization of time and territory. But all these systems were layered atop older ones, systems that did not demand glory but offered guidance. The Etruscan sense of rhythm, ritual rhythm, architectural rhythm, social rhythm, gave Rome a way to navigate the unknown. And in doing so, it gave generations of people a structure through which to live, to work, to believe. Even today, in a world of speed and noise, of signals that flicker and vanish, the Etruscan spirit invites us to slow down, to build with care, to remember that every form carries a function, and every function carries a feeling. A street is not only for walking, it is a place of movement, of memory, of possibility. A building is not just walls, it is space for breath and thought. A name carved into stone is not simply a label, it is a gesture of continuity. The Etruscans, though not often mentioned in textbooks or television shows, offer us something rare, the model of a culture that did not need to shout in order to shape. And perhaps that is why their story feels so restful, so fitting to explore in the hush of night. It is a reminder that you too are shaped by things you do not see, by languages long buried, by gestures repeated without question, by rituals inherited in silence. And it is a reminder that you too leave traces. In the words you write, in the way you greet someone, in how you structure your days. You may not build empires, you may not carve your name into marble, but what you do echoes, quietly, like the Etruscans. In the next part, we will gently bring this story to a close, not with a conclusion, but with a meditation on what it means to belong to a lineage that stretches backward, without a clear beginning, and forward, without a certain end. But for now, let yourself rest in the comfort of continuity. Let your breath settle into the rhythm of ancient footsteps. Let sleep find you beneath the stars that once watched over the cities of Etruria, still shining in the same sky, still waiting, still listening. Now we arrive at the final part of our quiet journey, a journey that did not begin with a great war or a legendary hero, but with a people who built carefully, lived thoughtfully, and disappeared so gradually that their absence felt more like a whisper than a silence. The Etruscans taught the Romans many things, but they also teach us something now, something softer, something more human. They teach us that legacy is not always loud. It does not always wear a crown or stand atop a pedestal. Sometimes, legacy is what you do when no one is watching. It is the way you build a roof to last beyond your years. It is the way you teach a child to read the sky. It is the way you carve a name into stone, not to be remembered, but to remember. The Etruscans remind us that every civilization begins somewhere quiet, that before there is glory, there is intention, that before there is empire, there is care. And as Rome rose, brick by brick, law by law, speech by speech, it stood not on empty ground, but on Etruscan foundations. Not just physical foundations, the walls, the roads, the gates, but spiritual ones, intellectual ones, symbolic ones. The Romans may have rewritten the story, but the handwriting began in another hand. And that matters, because history is not just the tale of who won, who ruled, or who wrote the laws. It is also the tale of who laid the first stone, who lit the first fire, who dared to believe that life was worth organizing, celebrating, and passing on. Even now, as you listen to these words in the hush of night, you are participating in something ancient, something older than Rome, older than memory. You are participating in the great human tradition of listening, of learning, of resting inside the stories of others. Stories like the Etruscans, half lost, half remembered, but never truly gone. Perhaps that is why they are so compelling, because they sit at the edge of what we know, a people remembered not through their victories, but through their influence, through their quiet shaping of a louder world. And as the centuries moved forward, as the empire expanded and contracted, as languages shifted and maps were redrawn, the traces of the Etruscans never vanished completely. Their cities crumbled, but their ideas remained. Their words faded, but their rituals endured. Their names disappeared from records, but lived on in echoes, in traditions, in architecture, in art. Today we still feel them, not always directly, but as if through a curtain, in the layout of an old Italian town, in the curved steps of an ancient theater, in the painted smile on a terracotta face, in the quiet reverence of a Roman temple's front porch. They are not gone, they have simply stepped back, into the background of things. And maybe that is the best place to be, not in the spotlight, but in the structure, not in the statue, but in the foundation beneath it, not in the noise of history, but in the rhythm of continuity. In your own life, too, there are Etruscan moments, things you build without recognition, habits you pass on without knowing, care you give without applause. These are the things that last, the things that shape others, the things that quietly change the world. And so, as the story ends, let yourself feel the weight of it. Not heavy, but grounding. Let the Etruscans walk with you a little longer. Let their calm remind you that stillness is not the absence of meaning. It is the space where meaning is made. Let your breath slow. Let your thoughts drift. Let sleep come. You are not alone in time. You are part of it. And somewhere beneath the layers of centuries, the Etruscans are still building. That brings our story to a close. Before we drift into the next quiet chapter, if you found peace here tonight, please consider giving this video a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps more sleepy minds find their way to these gentle stories. Now, let's continue our slow journey through the past. The next story in our Boring History for Sleep series takes us east, into a world of wisdom, restraint, and quiet power. This is the silent diplomacy of the Maurya Empire. Close your eyes. Let history soften once again. Far from the stone forums of Rome and the painted tombs of Etruria, in a land warmed by monsoon winds and shaded by banyan trees, rose an empire unlike any other, not forged solely through conquest, but also shaped through silence, calculation, and the careful weaving of diplomacy. The Maurya Empire, which emerged in the Indian subcontinent around the 4th century BCE, did not announce itself with spectacle. It did not thunder across borders. Instead, it spread softly like the rising heat of morning, carried by messengers and scribes, by reason and persuasion, by alliances both visible and hidden. Its foundations were laid by Chandragupta Maurya, a young man whose early life remains partly cloaked in mystery. Born in the shadow of the Nanda dynasty, he was guided by a thinker of rare sharpness, Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, a scholar, strategist, and author of the Arthashastra, one of the most detailed ancient texts on governance, economy, and statecraft. Together, these two minds, one young and ambitious, the other wise and relentless, built an empire that would stretch from the foothills of the Himalayas to the shores of the Arabian Sea. And yet, the Maurya Empire was not defined only by the lands it ruled. It was defined by how it ruled. Unlike the empires that rose through sheer military dominance, the Mauryas believed in structure, in order, in foresight. They built networks of spies not merely to uncover threats, but to understand the mood of the people. They sent envoys not just to negotiate borders, but to exchange ideas. They placed as much emphasis on knowledge as they did on territory. And beneath it all, diplomacy hummed quietly, like the flow of a river beneath still water. One of the most striking examples of this silent diplomacy occurred during the reign of Chandragupta's grandson, Ashoka. Though Ashoka's story, rich and complex, will come later. For now, in these early chapters of Mauryan history, we focus on the systems quietly forming. The roads they built were not only for trade, but for communication, smooth channels through which orders flowed and messages traveled. Rest houses and wells were placed thoughtfully along these routes. The movement of ideas was made possible through comfort. The Mauryans understood that diplomacy required infrastructure. To negotiate, you must be able to reach. To persuade, you must be able to listen. Their capital, Pataliputra, was a marvel not of scale alone, but of planning. Located near the confluence of the Ganges and Sun rivers, it was protected by walls and moats, but also filled with gardens, schools, and halls for discussion. It was not just a seat of power, it was a stage for conversation. Here, foreign envoys arrived. Greek ambassadors from the courts of Seleucus, Persian traders, local kings, each met not with bluster, but with intention. Diplomacy was not decoration, it was strategy, and yet it was done in quiet ways. Gifts were exchanged, rare woods, spices, fine cloth. Marriage alliances were arranged with care. Treaties were carved onto copper plates, not shouted from city walls. Behind every interaction was a principle. Stability was more valuable than conquest. Trust, once earned, was to be preserved. Even in moments of tension, negotiation was preferred over escalation. And when diplomacy did not prevent conflict, it softened its return. After battles, efforts were made to absorb and integrate rather than destroy and erase. The Mauryan approach to governance reflected the same thinking. Provincial governors were chosen for competence, not lineage. Taxation was standardized, but fairness was emphasized. Justice was layered. An early legal code governed both civil and criminal matters, with different levels of appeal. It was not perfect, but it was organized, thoughtful, purposeful. All of this was possible because the Mauryans understood the true meaning of diplomacy. It was not merely the art of words, it was the architecture of peace. In the next part, we will walk through the courts and palaces of Pataliputra and glimpse how the Mauryas used art, infrastructure, and subtle design to influence both ally and rival. But for now, let your mind settle in the softness of distant rain falling on palace rooftops and the slow turning of scrolls beneath lantern light. Let the silence of wise rulers lull you into rest. The Mauryas did not raise their voices, and yet the world listened. To understand how diplomacy flowed through the heart of the Maurya Empire, we must first walk, slowly and quietly, through the avenues of its capital, Pataliputra. Nestled along the banks of the Ganges River, surrounded by fertile plains and shaded by tamarind and neem trees, Pataliputra was not just a city of stone and structure. It was a reflection of the empire's mind. Here, silence had purpose, movement had meaning, and design itself was an act of governance. The city was laid out with symmetry, divided into carefully planned sectors, each one assigned for administration, commerce, residence, and ritual. Massive wooden walls, reinforced with stone and guarded by watchtowers, enclosed the city like arms holding something sacred. The streets inside were wide and straight, lined with trees and shaded arcades, allowing envoys, officials, and travelers to move freely without chaos. Cleanliness was maintained. Rest houses were provided. Wells were spaced with intention, a place built not for spectacle, but for conversation. It was within these orderly spaces that diplomacy took physical form. Palaces were built not to intimidate, but to invite. Their columns were carved with care, their halls lit with oil lamps and cooled with wet cloth curtains that swayed gently with the breeze. Visitors from distant lands, ambassadors from Hellenistic kingdoms, traders from Central Asia, emissaries from nearby republics, were received in surroundings that spoke without speaking. They saw not gold piled high, but harmony, not aggressive opulence, but intelligent comfort. Everything had purpose. Even the scent of sandalwood in the air was deliberate. Foreign accounts, such as those of the Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who visited the court of Chandragupta, paint a picture of a city that pulsed with quiet efficiency. He noted the bureaucracy, the order of officials, the detailed record-keeping, and the presence of councils. Decisions were not left to impulse. They were shaped by discussion, layered review, and the weighing of consequence. This methodical governance extended outward. The Mauryas did not simply send diplomats abroad, they trained them. An envoy was more than a messenger. He was a mirror of the empire's soul, chosen for wisdom, discretion, and grace. He carried with him not only scrolls, but a manner of thinking, a way of presenting respect without surrender, strength without noise. Even the gifts they offered were thoughtful: ivory carvings, rare herbs, woven cottons dyed with natural color, not symbols of dominance, but of refinement. Every interaction with another kingdom was treated like a thread in a larger fabric. Diplomacy was not a tool, it was a discipline. And within the empire, that same discipline shaped its administrative structure. The empire was divided into provinces, each governed by officials selected for their skills, not their family name. Taxation was recorded carefully. Local customs were respected. Law was made accessible. A complaint could travel through layers of scribes and overseers until it reached someone with the authority to respond. Justice flowed like a carefully dug canal, slow but steady. And underlying all of this was a belief that the empire must endure not through fear, but through function. The Mauryas believed in permanence, not through conquest alone, but through integration. By allowing regions to keep parts of their identity while aligning with central authority, they avoided revolt and fostered loyalty. Even their military, though strong and structured, was not the loudest face of the state. It was the scribe, the minister, the envoy, and the judge who most often carried the empire forward. Diplomacy, in Mauryan thinking, was not a soft alternative to power. It was power. It was the ability to shape outcomes before swords were drawn, to shift borders without breaking them, to resolve without noise. In the next part, we will explore the role of philosophy in Mauryan diplomacy, how thinkers like Chanakya blended pragmatism with moral caution, and how this mixture influenced policies that balanced strength with subtlety. But for now, let your breath follow the rhythm of ancient footfalls on polished palace floors, and let your thoughts rest beneath the shaded corridors of a city built not to dazzle, but to endure. The Mauryas spoke rarely, but when they did, the world leaned in. In the heart of the Maurya Empire, beneath the polished floors of government halls and behind the carved wooden doors of royal chambers, another kind of power took root, a power not defined by armies or walls, but by thought. It was the power of philosophy, and its influence on diplomacy was both quiet and profound. At the center of this intellectual current stood Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, the author of the Arthashastra. He was more than a scholar. He was a statesman, a strategist, a teacher, and a mirror to the soul of the empire. His work was not merely a manual of governance. It was a philosophy of survival, of order, of stability. It acknowledged the world as it was, complex, uncertain, filled with competing interests, and offered a path forward not through idealism, but through deliberate design. The Arthashastra laid out rules not only for taxation and law, but for negotiation, espionage, alliances, and betrayal. And yet, it was not a cold book. Beneath its practical advice lay a vision that a well-ordered society could prevent chaos, that diplomacy, done wisely, could prevent bloodshed. That peace was not the absence of struggle, but the careful management of human ambition. This blend of realism and restraint became a cornerstone of Mauryan diplomacy. Envoys were trained to understand the motivations of their counterparts, not to manipulate, but to anticipate. They were taught to listen before speaking, to observe before acting, to understand not just what was said, but what was not. Negotiations were often built on three pillars: trust, timing, and tact. Trust was not assumed. It was built over time through consistent behavior and mutual benefit. Timing was considered sacred, knowing when to speak, when to wait, and when silence would speak loudest. And tact was essential, choosing the right words, the right tone, the right gesture. In this, the Mauryas were not unlike chess players, always thinking several moves ahead. And yet, their strategy was never without ethics. The empire may have been pragmatic, but it was not ruthless. The goal of diplomacy was not dominance for its own sake, but stability, prosperity, continuity. Foreign rulers who submitted or allied with the Mauryas were often treated with respect. Their customs were acknowledged. Their people were not erased. This approach was revolutionary for its time. While other empires used fear and spectacle, the Mauryas used reason and patience. They did not seek to impress, they sought to endure. And philosophy was their silent guide. It shaped not only treaties, but also how rulers were advised to live: self-control, moderation, awareness. A king was not to act on impulse, but on counsel. A diplomat was not to speak from pride, but from purpose. Even deception, when used, was not celebrated, but weighed carefully. It was a tool, not a weapon. This philosophical foundation allowed the Mauryan Empire to grow without collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. It created space for dissent. It allowed adjustments. It turned complexity into cohesion. And in diplomacy, this mindset proved invaluable. Alliances were maintained not just through force, but through trust in a shared structure. Rivalries were cooled with calculated gifts and gestures. Even borders were flexible, managed through agreements rather than endless campaigns. Within the empire, this same principle applied. Governors were given autonomy within guidelines. Village leaders were respected as part of a larger framework. Bureaucracy was not an enemy of freedom. It was the scaffolding of peace. In the next part, we will step into the reign of Ashoka and witness how one of the most powerful emperors in Indian history turned away from conquest and toward a diplomacy shaped by compassion and Buddhist ideals. But for now, let your breath soften like the scrolls unrolled beneath lamplight in the halls of ancient advisors. Let your mind rest in the thought that wisdom, quietly applied, can build what armies never could. The Mauryas understood that silence, paired with intention, could echo farther than any war cry. In the quiet turning of history, there comes a moment when the tone of an empire shifts, not through rebellion or collapse, but through the mind of one ruler. And in the case of the Maurya Empire, that moment came during the reign of Emperor Ashoka, grandson of Chandragupta. His story is not one of dramatic speeches or sweeping declarations, but of reflection, remorse, and an inward turning that would forever reshape the meaning of diplomacy, not only in India, but across the ancient world. Ashoka, early in his reign, was like many kings, ambitious, determined, unafraid to expand the empire's reach through military strength. And he did just that, pushing the Mauryan borders farther than ever before. But then came Kalinga, a region along the eastern coast, rich in culture and independence. The conquest of Kalinga, though successful in military terms, became a turning point. Ashoka, witnessing the aftermath, the dead, the displaced, the broken families, was overwhelmed not with pride, but with sorrow. And from that sorrow, something rare emerged: transformation. He did not erase his power, he redirected it. From that moment forward, Ashoka's diplomacy was shaped not by victory, but by values. He embraced Buddhism, not as a tool, but as a guide. And through that lens, he began to govern differently. He saw the empire not as a field to conquer, but as a garden to tend. The principles of Dhamma, nonviolence, tolerance, compassion, respect, became the foundation of his domestic and foreign policy. And yet, this was not idealism without structure. Ashoka remained a ruler. He remained strategic. But now, his strategy had shifted. He sent envoys not just to neighboring states, but to distant kingdoms, to Sri Lanka, to Egypt, to Hellenistic Greece. These were not envoys carrying threats or demands. They carried messages of peace, of shared humanity, of mutual understanding. Stone edicts, carved across the empire, bore his words, not as royal boasts, but as quiet invitations to live with purpose and harmony. In one edict, he speaks not of conquest, but of regret. He admits that the suffering in Kalinga changed him. Few rulers in history have left such a record, not of glory, but of learning. This humility became the soul of Mauryan diplomacy under Ashoka. Foreign ambassadors were welcomed with kindness, and cultural exchange was encouraged. Buddhist monks traveled freely across borders, not only spreading spiritual teachings, but building bonds between distant peoples. Medical knowledge, agricultural practices, and ethical principles were shared. This was diplomacy not based on extraction, but on generosity. Within the empire, Ashoka reorganized governance to reflect these ideals. Officials were appointed to promote Dhamma, to listen to the people, to resolve disputes with fairness. Animal slaughter was restricted. Religious tolerance was emphasized. Public works flourished, not for prestige, but for the well-being of all. Trees were planted along roads, wells were dug, shelters were built. And throughout it all, diplomacy remained the quiet thread connecting regions, cultures, and people. Ashoka did not erase his predecessors' systems, he deepened them. The bureaucratic strength of Chandragupta, the philosophical grounding of Chanakya, these formed the skeleton. Ashoka added the heart. He proved that diplomacy could be principled without being weak. That peace, when paired with organization, could be more enduring than conquest. The Mauryan Empire under Ashoka did not shrink in influence. It expanded, not just across land, but across thought, across generations. In the next part, we will look at the long echo of Ashoka's diplomacy, how it influenced governance beyond his empire, how it shaped Buddhist foreign missions, and how his example remains one of the earliest models of ethical statecraft in recorded history. But for now, close your eyes to the sound of carved edicts standing silent in the forest, and travelers carrying scrolls of peace across the dusty plains. Let your breath follow the rhythm of a ruler who once wept for the fallen, and chose instead to build with kindness. The empire he led may have passed, but his message still drifts, soft and unbroken, like wind through leaves. As the Maurya Empire entered its most reflective phase under Ashoka's rule, something remarkable began to unfold, not just within its borders, but far beyond them. The diplomacy of the empire, once rooted in cautious statecraft and philosophical realism, now evolved into something even more profound, a form of cultural and moral outreach that transcended politics. While Ashoka still maintained the administrative machinery of the empire, his focus turned outward, not to claim territory, but to share values. This shift was not abrupt, nor did it discard the structures established by his predecessors. Rather, it flowed naturally from them. Where earlier diplomacy was practical and strategic, Ashoka's diplomacy became ethical, spiritual, and quietly revolutionary. Central to this new form of diplomacy was the idea of Dhamma, a Sanskrit word that is difficult to translate fully, but conveys a sense of duty, moral order, compassion, and living in harmony with others. Ashoka did not force his beliefs upon his people or upon foreign nations. Instead, he offered Dhamma as a shared principle, a common ground upon which diverse cultures could stand without losing themselves. The edicts he left behind, inscribed in stone across the vast stretches of his empire, were not laws in the traditional sense. They were reminders, gentle nudges toward kindness, tolerance, self-control, and mindfulness. They were carved in multiple languages, including Greek and Aramaic, ensuring that travelers and foreigners could understand. This too was diplomacy, the act of speaking clearly across boundaries, across cultures, without raising one's voice. But Ashoka did not stop at edicts. He sent emissaries, not warriors but monks and scholars, to far-off lands. Sri Lanka was among the first. There his son Mahinda and daughter Sangamita played key roles in the peaceful introduction of Buddhism. But it wasn't just about religion. These missions carried seeds, literally and metaphorically, seeds of medicinal plants, seeds of healing practices, seeds of thought. In doing so, Ashoka redefined what diplomacy could mean. It was no longer a transaction, it was a gift. He established relations with Hellenistic kingdoms, sending messages to rulers like Antiochus of Syria, Ptolemy of Egypt, and Magus of Cyrene. These letters, referenced in later historical sources, did not demand allegiance or tribute. They expressed concern for well-being, offered shared wisdom, and extended invitations to adopt peaceful practices. And while there is little evidence that these foreign rulers adopted Buddhism themselves, the gesture was powerful. It represented a vision of international relations based on mutual respect, rather than threat. Ashoka's example became rare in ancient history, a powerful king who used his strength not to dominate, but to connect. And even more remarkably, he remained grounded in daily acts. He instructed his officials to visit towns and villages, not merely to enforce rules, but to explain Dhamma, to listen to people's concerns, and to model ethical behavior. This practice was perhaps one of the earliest instances of moral governance through direct engagement. There were no triumphant parades, no lavish displays, just the steady work of tending to a vast and varied population with a consistent message that peace begins with patience and diplomacy begins with listening. Within the empire, Ashoka's policies encouraged harmony between different religious sects. He advocated for restraint in speech, respect for opposing views, and humility in one's convictions. This internal diplomacy, between belief systems, between regions, between communities, was just as vital as the external one. And so, under Ashoka, the Mauryan Empire became a network of shared values. Not enforced, but offered. Not mandated, but modeled. In the next part, we'll examine how the memory of Ashoka and Mauryan diplomacy continued to echo long after the empire's decline, through legend, through ruins, and through the enduring example of what leadership can look like when paired with gentleness. But for now, let your thoughts wander across the ancient roads where messengers once walked barefoot, carrying scrolls and silence. Let your breath move like the wind that passed over carved pillars, bearing words not of conquest, but of care. In this quiet, diplomacy becomes something more than politics. It becomes peace itself. Long after the last Mauryan official laid down his seal, and long after Ashoka's quiet footsteps faded from the corridors of Pataliputra, the echoes of Mauryan diplomacy continued to ripple across time, not as commands etched into law, but as whispers carried by stone, by memory, and by the steady hands of those who remembered what it meant to lead without shouting. The fall of the Maurya Empire, like so many empires before and after, was not dramatic in the moment. It came slowly, a gradual decentralization of authority, a fading of the structures that had once held everything together. After Ashoka's death around 232 BCE, his successors struggled to maintain the same unity. The vastness of the empire, once held together by shared values and efficient systems, began to fragment. Provinces became more independent. Local rulers reclaimed their authority. And yet, even as the political shape of the empire dissolved, the cultural and diplomatic legacy it left behind remained strangely resilient. The memory of Ashoka and of the Mauryan approach to governance survived not in conquest, but in stories, in artifacts, and in ideas. Buddhist texts across Southeast Asia, Sri Lanka, and Central Asia preserved tales of Ashoka not as a conqueror, but as a moral ruler. In these accounts, he was remembered as a king who regretted war, who protected all living beings, and who treated even his enemies with a sense of deep human dignity. Such memory, carried not by armies but by monks and pilgrims, traveled farther than any border once drawn on a Mauryan map. The pillars he had raised, carved with edicts in flowing Brahmi script, stood for centuries. Some fell, others remained upright, weathered but unbroken, silent witnesses to an era when governance and gentleness shared the same breath. Travelers, shepherds, and villagers passed them by, perhaps without reading the words, but always aware that something sacred had once been spoken there. These remnants became markers not just of a lost empire, but of a quiet ideal. In foreign lands, particularly in Sri Lanka, the impact of Mauryan diplomacy was not merely spiritual. The administrative structures introduced by Ashoka's missions influenced how local rulers governed. The concept of ethical kingship, where a leader was responsible not just for defense and taxation, but for the moral well-being of the people, spread gently, taking root in new soil. This form of legacy, quiet, adaptive, sustained through cultural transmission rather than military enforcement, was the ultimate proof of the Maurya's diplomatic strength. Even in India, centuries later, when new dynasties rose and fell, the name of Ashoka surfaced again and again in inscriptions and legends. Gupta kings in the 4th and 5th century CE would mention him. Later Buddhist kings would try to model their policies after his. Even in the modern era, as India searched for its national symbols, it returned once more to the Mauryas. The lion capital of Ashoka, a sculpture from Sarnath bearing 4 lions standing back to back, was adopted as the official emblem of India. The Dharma Chakra, the wheel of law carved beneath it, was placed at the center of the national flag. These choices were not decorative. They were acknowledgments. They whispered, "We remember. We still believe in the possibility of strength shaped by wisdom, of leadership guided by restraint." And so, long after the borders of the Maurya Empire vanished from the earth, its spirit remained. Not in palaces, but in principles. Not in monuments, but in meaning. And in this way, the Mauryas achieved what many louder empires never did. They endured not because of their size, but because of their ideas. In the next part, we'll look closer at some of the physical traces of Mauryan diplomacy, the inscriptions, the monuments, the networks that reveal how communication and intent were made visible, even across such a vast and varied land. But for now, let your thoughts settle gently among the quiet hills where old pillars still rise against the sky. Let your breath match the stillness of a message carved in stone, waiting patiently to be read. Let the silence of a fallen empire remind you that what is done with care and offered with kindness may outlive even the strongest walls. As we drift further into the lingering presence of the Maurya Empire, we find that even in its physical remains, scattered across forests, hilltops, and quiet plains, the philosophy of its diplomacy still breathes. Not in towering fortresses or statues of kings, but in more modest, deliberate things. Pillars, inscriptions, pathways. These were the tools of communication, carved not to dazzle, but to endure. Among the most iconic symbols of Mauryan diplomacy are the Ashokan edicts, carved into stone pillars, cave walls, and rock surfaces across the Indian subcontinent. These inscriptions were not hidden in palaces. They were placed where ordinary people lived and walked, on trade routes, near cities, beside rivers, in places where merchants, travelers, and villagers would pause and read or listen as someone read aloud. The purpose of these edicts was not only administrative. They were meant to speak, gently, clearly, and consistently, about the values the empire hoped to uphold. They conveyed respect for all life, encouragement for tolerance among religious groups, kindness to servants and animals, the importance of patience, humility, and self-discipline. These were not messages to glorify the king. They were messages to guide the people. In an age when rulers were often remembered for victories in battle, Ashoka chose to be remembered for victories of the heart. And this quiet decision to speak in stone, to speak in many languages, and to speak for everyone was a revolutionary act of diplomacy. The edicts were inscribed in Brahmi script, Prakrit language, and in regions with Greek and Aramaic speakers. The inscriptions were adapted to suit their audience. This showed not only cultural awareness, but a deep intention to reach across linguistic and ethnic lines. It was a diplomacy of clarity, built on inclusion. Imagine for a moment a traveler resting beneath a tree beside one of these pillars. The pillar stands tall, unadorned except for the carved letters spiraling downward. No gold, no divine imagery, no violent triumphs, just a message, patiently carved by skilled hands, asking the reader to be better, to think of others, to live with purpose. This was diplomacy by example, not by decree. And the placement of these messages was also strategic. Many were carved near key trade routes, where merchants from many lands passed. Others stood near borders, welcoming signs, almost quiet declarations of what kind of empire this was. Not a fortress to fear, but a realm with rules, with rhythm, with thought. The Mauryas understood that diplomacy was not only what was said in court, but what was silently conveyed through space and design. This same sensibility is seen in the road systems developed under the Mauryas. Long highways connected the empire from north to south, east to west, allowing not only armies and goods to travel, but also ideas, people, and intentions. Wells, trees, rest stations, and milestones lined these roads, creating a feeling of care, a sense that movement was expected and supported. Travelers were not left to fate. They were guided, protected, encouraged. And this too was diplomacy, the infrastructure of empathy, the logistical preparation for peace. Ashoka also established networks of medical centers for humans and animals alike, not only within his empire but in neighboring lands. His inscriptions mention the planting of medicinal herbs in territories under his control and beyond. This outward-facing generosity reflected a vision of diplomacy where service, not domination, shaped international relationships. In many ways, these physical remnants, stone inscriptions, shaded roads, quiet gardens, feel almost like prayers made permanent. They do not ask to be noticed. They ask only to be understood. And perhaps that is why they still move us, because they were never designed for power alone. They were designed for presence. In the next part, we'll explore how Mauryan diplomatic thought influenced later rulers and empires across Asia and beyond, how its quiet legacy flowed into new political systems, new spiritual movements, and modern philosophies of leadership. But for now, rest in the stillness of a traveler's shelter along a long-forgotten road. Let your breath match the rhythm of footsteps softened by time. Let the words carved in stone, once meant for strangers, now gently speak to you. The empire is gone, but the message remains. As we continue walking through the long shadow of the Maurya Empire, we find that its diplomacy did not stop at the empire's edge, nor did it vanish when the dynasty dissolved. Like seeds scattered on a gentle breeze, the ideas it planted grew elsewhere, in neighboring kingdoms, in future empires, in spiritual traditions, and in the quiet minds of those who carried its memory forward. Mauryan diplomacy was not just a system, it was a mindset, a way of approaching power, territory, relationships, and responsibility. And in the centuries that followed, that mindset left fingerprints far beyond the Indian subcontinent. One of the most immediate and lasting impacts was felt in Sri Lanka. After Ashoka sent his children, Mahinda and Sanghamitta, to the island nation, not only was Buddhism introduced peacefully and respectfully, but also the Mauryan approach to cultural diplomacy, sharing without conquering, offering without demanding, became a model for future relations. The establishment of monastic communities, the preservation of texts, the planting of the Bodhi tree from India and Sri Lanka, all these were acts of diplomacy as much as devotion. They created bonds that lasted centuries. Sri Lankan kings would later refer to Ashoka as a model of righteous leadership, and his name would be passed down with reverence in chronicles and temple inscriptions. In Southeast Asia, too, the influence of Mauryan thought gently made its way across waters. Though no Mauryan army ever set foot in those regions, traders, monks, and teachers did. And with them came not only religious teachings, but cultural expectations, how a ruler might govern with restraint, how dialogue could replace conflict, how power could be shaped by compassion. These ideas did not replace local customs. They blended softly, creating hybrid traditions that honored both the past and the present. And then there was Central Asia. As Hellenistic kingdoms rose and fell after Alexander the Great, and as Indo-Greek rulers established territories along the edges of former Mauryan lands, the echoes of Mauryan diplomacy could still be felt. Trade continued. Dialogue persisted. Coins from that era sometimes bore inscriptions in multiple languages, a sign that multilingualism, promoted during Ashoka's time, had endured. A recognition that diplomacy across cultures must begin with understanding the languages of others, not only their words, but their ways of thinking. The Kushan Empire, which rose centuries later and spanned much of northern India and Central Asia, adopted many Buddhist practices introduced during the Mauryan period. Their rulers, like Kanishka, supported Buddhist councils, funded monasteries, and sent missions across Asia. Though their motivations were their own, the precedent had been set. Diplomacy through culture, through belief, through shared values. It was a road the Mauryas had already begun to pave. Even within India, later dynasties like the Guptas and the Cholas reflected aspects of Mauryan diplomacy. The Guptas, while more focused on Hindu traditions, still upheld principles of religious tolerance and administrative fairness. The Cholas, known for their maritime power, engaged in trade and diplomacy with Southeast Asia, echoing the ancient belief that relationships with others were most sustainable when built on mutual respect. In each case, the silent logic of Mauryan statecraft remained quietly present, a trust in communication over conquest, a belief in the power of shared values, a respect for diversity within unity. And though centuries passed, and the names of kings changed, and the maps were redrawn again and again, the essence of Mauryan diplomacy lingered, not as law, not as doctrine, but as a current beneath the surface, soft, slow, and steady. In the modern world, echoes of Mauryan diplomacy can still be found in peaceful foreign exchanges, in international aid offered without strings, in the quiet influence of nonviolence, as later championed by Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi himself often referenced Ashoka, not because they ruled alike, but because they both believed in the strength of peaceful conviction. In the next part, we'll explore how Mauryan ideals influenced global thought centuries later, as travelers, scholars, and leaders looked back to this ancient empire for inspiration in their own times of uncertainty. But for now, let your breath slow like the tides that carried merchant ships from India to distant ports. Let your thoughts drift like scrolls passed from one hand to another. The Maurya Empire may have disappeared from the earth, but its diplomacy still moves quietly through history, like a language half-remembered, waiting to be spoken again. As the centuries moved onward and empires rose and fell like the slow rhythm of tides, the silent lessons of the Maurya Empire remained embedded in the cultural soil of Asia. Even when they were no longer mentioned by name, their influence lingered, subtle like the trace of perfume in an empty room, or the warmth left behind after a candle has burned low. In every great civilization that came after, there were echoes, not always direct imitations but gentle reflections, of what the Mauryas had once practiced with quiet confidence. One of the most enduring aspects of Mauryan diplomacy was the understanding that power, to be sustainable, had to be partnered with legitimacy. Not just the legitimacy of force or lineage, but of moral grounding. The Mauryas had laid this foundation early through their support of ethical governance and religious tolerance. Ashoka especially emphasized the ruler's duty not only to enforce order, but to embody compassion. This concept would re-emerge in many guises centuries later. In the Tang dynasty of China, for instance, Confucian ideals of virtue-based rule resonated with similar tones. The idea that a ruler must lead by example, must earn respect through conduct, not just command. These beliefs, though rooted in different traditions, felt familiar to the path Ashoka had once walked. Even the concept of a universal ruler, one who protected all people, regardless of class or belief, took shape in different forms across Asia, inspired in part by the vision of an empire that once stretched from the Himalayas to the Bay of Bengal. And it was not only in great capitals that these ideas found life. In monasteries scattered across Asia, in Tibet, in Korea, in Japan, Ashoka's name was remembered with reverence. Stories of his conversion, his regret over the Kalinga War, his devotion to nonviolence and dharma were preserved and retold, not just as historical accounts, but as parables, as reminders that greatness is not only forged in conquest, but in conscience. In modern times, scholars began to rediscover the true depth of the Mauryan achievement. In the 19th century, British archaeologists working in India stumbled upon ancient pillars carved with strange scripts. For years, they puzzled over the inscriptions, until the Brahmi script was finally deciphered. And what they uncovered was not a king boasting of victory, but a voice speaking gently across time. Ashoka's words, carved in stone over 2,000 years earlier, spoke of kindness, patience, humility, and the welfare of all beings. In an age dominated by industrial ambition and colonial expansion, such words seemed almost out of place. And yet they struck a chord, thought but unmistakable. These discoveries would reshape how historians saw ancient India. No longer was it only the land of mysticism or exotic kingdoms. It became clear that here, long before the West had articulated its modern concepts of diplomacy and ethics, there had existed a sophisticated state that wove them quietly into its every act. The Mauryan model also gained new relevance in the 20th century. As India moved toward independence, leaders searched for historical figures who could symbolize the values of the new nation. Many turned to Ashoka, not as a conqueror, but as a reconciler. His lion capital was chosen as the national emblem. His wheel of Dharma, the Ashoka chakra, was placed at the center of the Indian flag, not as a religious symbol, but as a quiet nod to motion, progress, and timeless wisdom. In this way, Mauryan diplomacy returned once more to the present, not as nostalgia, but as guidance. And today, though the empire is long gone, the principles that once shaped it continue to whisper through modern institutions, through conversations about peace, environmental care, and pluralism. They ask the same questions. How do we lead without dominating? How do we build without oppressing? How do we speak across boundaries of language, culture, belief, with both clarity and care? The Mauryas never claimed to answer all these questions perfectly, but they dared to ask them, long before it was common to do so. In the final part of the story, we will let the legacy settle into silence once more, examining the beauty of an empire that knew how to retreat with grace, how to speak without shouting, and how to build a history that whispers its way gently into the hearts of those still listening. But for now, let your breath slow again, like ink settling into the grooves of ancient stone. Let your mind rest beside an old pillar, carved not for glory, but for understanding. And let the quiet wisdom of long ago accompany you into stillness. As we draw near the close of this quiet exploration through the corridors of time, let us pause once more beneath the gentle shadow of the Maurya Empire. There is something oddly comforting in knowing that such a vast and powerful civilization once chose restraint over noise, clarity over spectacle, and care over control. Theirs was not a perfect world. There were wars, there was hardship, there were mistakes. But within the folds of their rule, there lay a conscious choice to approach diplomacy not merely as a tool of survival, but as a philosophy, a way of being in the world. The last echoes of the Mauryan dynasty began to fade around 185 BCE, when the final emperor, Brihadratha, was assassinated by his general Pushyamitra Shunga, who founded a new ruling house. And with that, the curtain gently fell on one of the most fascinating chapters in ancient history. But unlike the dramatic ends of other empires, marked by fire, siege, or exile, the fall of the Mauryas was curiously silent. There were no grand declarations, no desperate resistance, just a fading of light, as if the empire itself had known when to let go. And perhaps that too was part of its legacy, not clinging to power until all was lost, but allowing history to carry it forward in quieter ways, through ideas, through language, through memory. What made Mauryan diplomacy so enduring was not that it imposed itself on the world, but that it left room. Room for dialogue, room for difference, room for others to rise and shape their own paths. It was a diplomacy of listening, of building bridges rather than walls. In a way, it was like water. It moved around obstacles rather than smashing through them. It nourished where it flowed rather than scorched. And though empires that came after may have been louder or larger, few have matched the Mauryas in the grace of their withdrawal or the quiet power of their influence. Even now, in the 21st century, there are lessons to be drawn from their example. In an age of rapid communication, of sharp rhetoric, and of constant noise, the value of silent strength becomes even more apparent. The Mauryas remind us that true diplomacy begins not with demands, but with listening, not with threats, but with clarity, not with pride, but with purpose. They remind us that lasting impact is often not made in moments of triumph, but in moments of reflection, in decisions made far from the battlefield, in words carved slowly into stone, in gestures that ask for nothing in return. As we let this story fade into the soft stillness of night, imagine once more a traveler walking along one of the great roads built during Ashoka's reign. The trees cast long shadows, the birds quiet in the evening heat. In the distance, a pillar rises, tall, weathered, unassuming. The traveler stops to read, tracing the ancient script with their eyes. The message is simple: be kind, be thoughtful, respect all life. And then the traveler moves on, a little lighter in spirit, a little more at peace. That, perhaps, is the final message of the Maurya Empire. That diplomacy, in its truest form, is not only about treaties or titles, but about the small ways we choose to treat one another. It lives in every moment we pause before speaking, in every time we try to understand before judging, in every effort to build, not for ourselves alone, but for something that will last. Let that idea stay with you, gently, as your thoughts begin to soften and scatter. Let it rest beside you, like a whisper that never needed to be loud to be heard. The Maurya Empire is long gone. Its rulers, its borders, its cities, all have crumbled into dust, but its wisdom lingers, in stone, in silence, in stories like this one, carried forward by those still willing to listen. Leap now, if you haven't already. Let your breath follow the rhythm of an empire that once moved with care. Let your dreams unfold like old maps under soft candlelight. And when morning comes, carry with you the quiet strength of those who ruled not with fear, but with thought. That brings us to the end of tonight's quiet journey through the Maurya Empire. If you're still awake and this story brought you any calm or comfort, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps these gentle tales reach others who need a little peace too. Now, let's stay on this soft path through history and move slowly toward our next chapter. Tonight, we travel west to ancient Greece, to olive groves, sacred hills, and a gathering that began not in war, but in peace. This is the peaceful origins of the Olympic Games. Close your eyes and let us drift once more into the quiet past. Long before the roar of modern stadiums, before the flash of cameras and the blaze of Olympic torches, there was only the quiet hum of cicadas in the olive trees, the hush of sandals on ancient stone, and the distant echo of names spoken in reverence. The Olympic Games, as we know them today, are a global spectacle of speed, strength, and unity. But their beginnings were simpler, quieter. They emerged not from conquest or ambition, but from a shared yearning for peace. A pause in the rhythm of war, a chance for humanity to look inward and upward. To begin the story, we must journey far back into the mists of ancient Greece, to a time before city-states had solid walls or standardized coins. Somewhere between myth and memory, the earliest records whisper of a sacred place called Olympia. Nestled in the western Peloponnese, Olympia was not a mighty capital nor a military outpost. It was a sanctuary, a grove thick with olive trees, dotted with shrines, and bathed in golden sunlight. Here, beneath the watchful eyes of Mount Kronos and alongside the gentle Alpheus River, the Greeks came not to battle, but to celebrate. The earliest Olympic Games are believed to have taken place around 776 BCE. This date is not definitive, but it is the first recorded in ancient Greek history and used as a starting point for many of their calendars. Yet even before this, traditions and competitions likely existed, passed down through oral custom and local ritual. At the heart of the games was Zeus, the king of the gods. The sanctuary at Olympia was dedicated to him, and it was said that the competitions honored his strength and justice. Participants were not merely athletes, they were pilgrims. Their journey to Olympia was spiritual as much as physical. They traveled for days, sometimes weeks, across difficult terrain to compete not only for personal glory, but to offer their excellence to something greater than themselves. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the early Olympics was the concept of the ekcheria, the Olympic truce. Declared by heralds in every corner of the Greek world, this truce called for the suspension of all hostilities during the Games. City-states that had been at war, sometimes bitterly, sometimes for generations, would agree to lay down their weapons, not forever, but long enough for athletes, spectators, priests, and artisans to travel safely to and from Olympia. This was not enforced by a central power. It was upheld by honor, by belief. And remarkably, for centuries, it worked. In an age of constant conflict, the Olympic truce was a radical idea. It did not demand peace, it invited it. It did not command obedience, it inspired participation. And in this delicate balance of faith and fellowship, the Games endured. The competitions themselves were modest at first. The earliest event was the Stadion, a short foot race covering roughly 600 feet. Over time, new events were added. The Diaulos, a double-length race, the Dolichos, a long-distance run, wrestling, discus, javelin, and the iconic pentathlon, which combined 5 skills to test an athlete's versatility. But the Games were never only about physical prowess. They were also about discipline, harmony, and presence. Athletes competed in the nude, not for spectacle, but for purity. Their bodies were seen as expressions of form and balance, not as objects of vanity. Victors were crowned with a simple wreath of olive leaves, cut from a sacred tree said to have been planted by Heracles himself. There were no medals, no money, no endorsements, just honor and memory. Winners returned home as heroes, not because they had defeated others, but because they had honored Zeus, their city, and themselves. Back in Olympia, their names were inscribed in stone, joining the quiet company of those who came before. The crowds that gathered were not merely spectators. They were part of a living ritual. They sang hymns. They offered sacrifices. They watched the lighting of sacred fires. And in those moments, when thousands of people sat in shared silence beneath the open sky, it was as if the world itself exhaled. A world torn by rivalry found stillness, if only for a few days. As we rest here in this first part of our journey through the ancient Olympics, let your breath settle like dust on old stone. Imagine the rustle of trees above the stadium, the soft call of a flute, the distant chant of a poet reciting stories older than memory. In Part 2, we'll follow the evolution of the Games, how they grew, changed, and weathered the shifting winds of politics and empire. But for now, let sleep come gently, like the olive branches swaying in the evening breeze. As the centuries unfolded gently across the ancient Greek landscape, the Olympic Games began to grow, not just in size, but in meaning. What began as a small sacred gathering beneath olive trees in Olympia gradually became one of the most enduring cultural institutions of the classical world. Yet this growth, like the spread of ivy along a marble column, was slow, steady, and deeply rooted in tradition. The early years saw the addition of new events, but also a careful curation of the spirit in which they were held. Wrestling, chariot racing, long jump, and even the pankration, a form of unarmed combat that tested both skill and endurance, were gradually introduced. These were not just displays of brute force. They were rituals, each governed by strict rules and performed with a sense of solemnity. Judges, known as Hellenodikai, were chosen from among respected citizens and underwent 10 months of training to prepare for their role. They were not merely referees, but guardians of fairness and decorum. Athletes, too, submitted themselves to a period of preparation before the Games. For 30 days prior to competition, they lived in a special facility near Olympia, training under supervision, following a regulated diet, and learning not only techniques of sport, but the behaviors expected of one who would compete in Zeus's name. This emphasis on discipline created a unique atmosphere. Victory was celebrated, but arrogance was not. Defeat was accepted, not as shame, but as part of the journey. The Olympics were never about individualism alone. They were about representing one's polis, one's city-state, with dignity. And because of that, they became a form of diplomacy in themselves. Ambassadors attended the Games. Philosophers debated in nearby courtyards. Poets composed verses praising both winners and ideals. Olympia, during the festival, became a kind of temporary capital of the Greek world, not ruled by swords or kings, but by shared reverence. Meanwhile, the Ekecheria, or Olympic truce, continued to be honored. It was not always perfect. There were times when tensions flared, or when small skirmishes threatened the spirit of peace. But for the most part, the truce endured, because the Greeks believed in it. They believed that even in a world marked by rivalry, there could be spaces of stillness. They believed that even warriors needed a place to lay down their arms, if only for a season. In this way, the Olympics acted as a thread of continuity through a patchwork world. City-states might disagree, but they all agreed on Olympia. Rival rulers might clash, but they all sent their champions to the games. The very act of gathering, of traveling to one place, honoring one set of rules, and celebrating one set of values, helped maintain a fragile but vital sense of cultural unity. Olympia itself reflected this harmony. Its temples were not garish monuments of conquest, but quiet structures of devotion. The Temple of Hera, among the oldest, stood in balance with the grander Temple of Zeus, which housed the famed statue by the sculptor Phidias, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Made of ivory and gold, the statue of Zeus sat on a throne, serene and powerful. It was not there to intimidate, it was there to remind both athletes and onlookers that strength should be wielded with justice. That glory, however bright, was fleeting, and that what truly endured was virtue. As we drift through this second chapter, let the image settle in your mind. A wide-open stadium, carved into the earth, filled with silence before a race. The sun is high, the dust is still, and then movement. Not loud, not frantic, just a steady rhythm of feet on sand. A reminder that excellence is not always shouted, it is often whispered through effort. In Part 3, we will watch the games continue to evolve, weathering the arrival of empires and the changes of civilization. But for now, rest in the knowledge that for hundreds of years, people came together not to conquer, but to compete with honor. And in doing so, they created a legacy that still lives, softly in every corner of our modern world. And as the ancient Olympic Games settled deeper into the rhythms of Greek life, their influence quietly expanded, like ripples moving outward across the still surface of a sacred spring. The Games were no longer just a religious festival or a collection of competitions. They had become a shared cultural compass. Every 4 years, as the moon reached its summer fullness, messengers were sent out from Olympia to announce the start of the sacred truce. They traveled across mountains and valleys, from the shores of the Aegean to the dusty plains beyond Thebes, reminding cities to lay down arms and honor peace. These heralds, known as spondophoroi, were symbols of a gentler power, one that asked not for allegiance, but for stillness, and stillness came. Merchants paused their trade, soldiers returned to their homes, sculptors put down their chisels. Even rival cities, locked in dispute, observed the silence, because the games belonged to all of them. Olympia remained unchanged in many ways. The groves of olive trees still whispered in the breeze. The temple of Zeus stood watch in golden silence, but the world around it had begun to shift. Greece itself was not a single nation, but a mosaic of fiercely independent city-states: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Delphi, each with its own customs, dialects, and pride. The Olympic Games, then, offered something rare: unity. Not political unity, not military unity, but a shared mythos, a shared rhythm, a shared reverence. Athletes trained for years for a chance at that single race, that single throw, that single match. And when they stood at the starting line, they stood not only for themselves, but for the police that had raised them. And yet, despite the prestige, the prize remained humble. A wreath woven from the branches of a sacred olive tree known as the Kallistephanos. No gold, no silver, no coin, just the memory, the applause, the stories carried back home. And for the victor, the chance to inspire. Fame was not measured by wealth, but by virtue, arete, as the Greeks called it. It meant excellence, but not just physical excellence. Moral excellence, mental clarity, a commitment to balance, to grace, to the sacred harmony between body and mind. The Games also welcomed artistry. Poets and musicians gathered at Olympia, their verses echoing through marble courtyards. Sculptors carved statues of victors, idealized not for vanity, but for commemoration. Philosophers strolled through the grove, discussing ethics, politics, and purpose beneath the shade. It was said that Pindar, the great poet, composed odes in honor of champions, not because they were strong, but because they reminded people of the divine order. For a time, this world held. For centuries, the Olympic cycle continued. Through changing alliances, new wars, and the rise of new cities, the Games remained a touchstone. They were never interrupted, not even when entire regions shifted power or temples crumbled in distant earthquakes. But change, though patient, is persistent. In the distance beyond the seas, another force was stirring: Rome. The Roman Republic was growing, and eventually, it would touch every corner of the Greek world. With it came new ideas, new politics, new priorities. And though the Romans admired Greek culture, they studied its texts, borrowed its gods, and even adopted many of its traditions, the Olympic Games would not remain untouched. They began to take on new meaning. The quiet reverence started to mingle with spectacle. Chariot races became louder, celebrations grew more elaborate, and although the sacred truce was still declared, it became harder to enforce in a world where power no longer rested in a grove, but in an empire. And yet, the spirit lingered. Like the last embers of a fire, it glowed softly beneath the surface. There were still athletes who trained for the love of discipline, still artists who honored the old ways, still pilgrims who arrived not for applause, but for silence. The Olympic flame may have flickered, but it was not yet gone. As we pause at the edge of this chapter, let the images drift gently into your thoughts. The sun dipping low behind the temple of Hera, the smell of laurel and crushed earth, a boy kneeling to tie the laces of his sandals before a race that would be remembered for generations. The world may change, but in the heart of Olympia, time moved slowly, and for a few days, every 4 years, peace was not just a hope, it was a ritual. In Part 4, we'll follow the Games as they enter the Roman age, how they were preserved, transformed, and nearly lost. But for now, let your breath settle. Let your thoughts drift back to the grove, and let the echoes of ancient footsteps guide you into sleep. As the Greek world gradually yielded to the rise of Rome, the Olympic Games found themselves at a crossroads. Once nestled in the heart of independent city-states, guarded by tradition and shielded by a sacred truce, the Games now faced an expanding empire whose ambitions reached beyond the Aegean. Rome admired Greece, that much was true. Roman scholars studied Greek philosophy. Roman poets echoed Greek verse. Roman architects mimicked Greek temples. But admiration does not always mean preservation. The Olympic Games continued, but the winds were shifting. Rome brought with it a different rhythm, one of military precision, grand construction, and public spectacle. The Roman Republic, and later the Empire, valued entertainment on a massive scale. Colosseums, gladiators, chariot races that drew tens of thousands. While the Greeks held sacred the balance between body and soul, the Romans leaned toward spectacle and might. Olympia, with its olive groves and ancient altars, still held meaning, but it no longer stood alone as the spiritual center of athletic excellence. Other cities, Delphi, Nemea, Isthmia, hosted their own games. And eventually, Rome began organizing contests under its own banner, often tied not to the gods, but to emperors and their legacies. Still, Olympia endured. The sacred truce was still announced, though not always honored. The events continued, though their tone began to change. Victors still received olive wreaths, but they might also expect statues, banquets, or imperial favor. The crowds grew larger, the competitions more diverse. And while some clung to the old ways, others embraced the new, adding flair, celebration, and grandeur to what was once a quiet gathering in honor of Zeus. The Temple of Zeus itself, home to the immense statue by Phidias, stood as a testament to the golden age of the Games. But even stone grows weary. Earthquakes shook Olympia, fires consumed the sanctuary more than once. And still the Games went on, adapted, but not extinguished. Roman emperors occasionally visited or sponsored the Olympics. Some, like Nero, even competed. In one infamous case, Nero entered a chariot race with 10 horses instead of the traditional 4. He fell from his chariot mid-race and was still declared the winner. Moments like this hinted at a slow unraveling of the game's deeper meaning. No longer was victory a quiet testament to virtue. It was increasingly a reflection of favor, power, and visibility. And yet, Olympia still called to pilgrims. The stadium still echoed with footfalls. The altars still burned offerings. For centuries more, through wars and transitions, the games persisted. But change was approaching, not in the form of empire, but of belief. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had spread throughout the Roman Empire. Once a persecuted sect, it had become the official religion, and with it came new ideas about worship, sacrifice, and tradition. The old gods were no longer tolerated, they were condemned. Pagan temples were closed, shrines were destroyed, and sacred festivals, including the Olympics, were seen not as noble traditions, but as remnants of a bygone heretical past. In 393 CE, Emperor Theodosius III issued a decree banning all pagan festivals. The Olympic Games, after over 1,000 years of quiet endurance, were officially ended. The stadiums emptied. The altars were left cold. The statue of Zeus, once a wonder of the world, was taken to Constantinople, where it was eventually lost to fire. Olympia itself fell into disrepair. Over time, the river shifted course. Sediment buried temples. Trees reclaimed the paths once worn smooth by countless feet. The games, it seemed, had finally gone silent. And yet silence is not the same as forgetting. The stories lingered. In texts, in songs, in ruins. The idea that for centuries, humanity gathered not to fight, but to run, jump, wrestle, and praise, the idea endured. Travelers centuries later would stand among the stones of Olympia and wonder, who stood here before me? What did they feel, waiting for their name to be called, their moment to arrive? What kind of world allows peace to live, even briefly, every 4 years? As you drift into rest tonight, hold that image close. A grove in quiet bloom, a flame lit before dawn, the soft murmur of a crowd not come to conquer, but to witness. And somewhere in the stillness, the echo of an athlete's breath, steady and true, before the race begins. In Part 5, we'll trace the long centuries that followed, the forgetting, the rediscovery, and the rebirth of the games in a different world. But for now, sleep in the comfort of what once was. A time when peace had a place, and all the world paused to remember. Centuries passed in silence. The ruins of Olympia, once alive with footsteps and laughter, were gradually overtaken by the earth. Wind swept through empty colonnades. Ivy crept across crumbling stones, and the stadium, once worn smooth by the souls of champions, grew soft with soil and grass. The Olympic Games, for over 1,000 years, were forgotten. The world had changed. Empires rose and fell. The Western Roman Empire collapsed. Christianity spread across Europe. New kings ruled over old cities. Wars reshaped borders, and faith reshaped identities. Pagan temples, if not destroyed, were repurposed or buried. And the memory of the ancient Olympics faded, not completely erased, but muted, like the fading echo of a song once sung around sacred fires. Travelers passed through the Peloponnese without knowing what lay beneath their feet. Olympia slumbered beneath layers of time and earth. It wasn't until the modern age, centuries later, that whispers of the past began to stir once more. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Europe turned its eyes to antiquity with renewed curiosity, scholars and adventurers began to seek the lost world of the Greeks. Archaeology was still in its infancy, but the desire to rediscover grew. Ancient texts hinted at a place called Olympia, where temples had once stood and games had once been held. Explorers followed those clues. They mapped, they dug, and slowly, stone by stone, Olympia began to return. Buried columns were unearthed. Altar remnants were identified. Even the outlines of the ancient stadium emerged, long and narrow, just as the ancients had described. Inscriptions, statues, pottery, all spoke of a world that had once gathered here in peace. The past, it seemed, was not lost. It had simply been waiting. Meanwhile, in another corner of the world, an idea was beginning to take shape. In France, a young man named Pierre de Coubertin studied history, philosophy, and education. He believed that sports could do more than build strong bodies. They could build character, community, and peace. Inspired by the ideals of the ancient Greeks, Coubertin dreamed of reviving the Olympic Games, not as a religious ritual, but as a celebration of international friendship. He envisioned athletes from all nations competing not in war, but in goodwill, not under the flags of empires, but as individuals striving for excellence. It was a dream that seemed bold, even naive. The late 19th century was an age of competition, of colonization, of rising tensions. And yet, in 1896, the dream became reality. The first modern Olympic Games were held in Athens. Over 2,000 years after the last race was run in Olympia, the flame had been rekindled. The crowd gathered not in a grove, but in a stadium built of marble. Athletes came not from just a few city-states, but from many nations. There was no temple to Zeus, no statue by Phidias, no sacred truce, but there was applause. There was effort. There was spirit. And in that, the ancient games lived again. The early editions of the modern Olympics were simple compared to today's spectacle. There were no massive sponsorships, no television broadcasts, no global ceremonies. Just running, jumping, swimming. A javelin soaring through the air, a pole vaulter clearing the bar, a crowd holding its breath. But with each passing cycle, the games grew. More countries joined, more sports were added. And the Olympic values, excellence, respect, friendship, began to travel farther than even the Greek heralds of old could have imagined. In time, the Olympic flame became a symbol known around the world. It was lit in Olympia, as it still is today, and carried across continents to the host city, not for power, not for profit, but for remembrance, for the spirit of gathering, of trying, of peace. And through wars, depressions, and changes, the flame endured. There were games held in the shadow of conflict, games canceled by global war, games boycotted, games criticized. But always the idea survived, that every few years we could come together, not perfectly, not without flaws, but with hope. In Part 6, we will follow how the modern games continued to evolve, sometimes stumbling, sometimes shining, but always reaching back, quietly, to the grove at Olympia. But for now, let your mind rest beside the ancient stones. Let the wind of history whisper through your thoughts, and let the peaceful origins of the Olympic spirit lull you gently toward sleep. The revival of the Olympic Games in 1896 marked not just a return to athletic tradition, but a quiet reawakening of a forgotten ideal. As the decades moved forward, the Games evolved, slowly at first, then steadily gaining momentum. Each new edition, held in a different corner of the world, added new layers to a growing mosaic of international unity. But the core remained the same: young people from many nations, gathering not for conquest, but for challenge, personal, physical, and peaceful. The early 20th century saw modest beginnings. There were hurdles to overcome: limited travel, political resistance, unequal participation. But every 4 years, the rhythm repeated, echoing the ancient cycle. A torch was lit, athletes trained, flags were raised. In 1924, the Winter Olympics were introduced, adding snow and ice to the growing tradition, skiers and skaters joining runners and wrestlers. The Games adapted, they responded to a world in motion, and yet they remained grounded in something remarkably old: the belief that competition need not divide, but could connect. It was never perfect. The Olympic Games, though rooted in peace, could not always escape the world's turmoil. In 1916, 1940, and 1944, the Games were cancelled, swallowed by the vast shadows of war. It was as if the world, in its darkest hours, forgot how to pause. And still, after each silence, the flame returned. In 1948, just 3 years after the end of the Second World War, London hosted the Games in a city still scarred by bombings and rationing. Athletes slept in schools. Venues were repaired with haste. But the spirit burned brightly. Germany and Japan were not invited that year. The world was not yet healed. But something had begun. The post-war Games carried with them a quiet hope that through sport, understanding might grow where suspicion once lived. In the decades that followed, the Olympics mirrored the changes of the world around them. During the Cold War, the Games became a subtle battleground of ideologies. East and West met on neutral fields, not with weapons, but with speed and strength. Medals became symbols, victories were claimed as statements, and yet, despite the tensions, moments of humanity persisted. Athletes embraced across lines of language and politics. Stories emerged, not of division, but of friendship, of athletes lending shoes to competitors, of rivals training together, of gestures made not for the cameras, but for the soul. The Olympic Charter, a quiet document not often read aloud, held within it a powerful message. It spoke of building a peaceful and better world through sport, of placing education, culture, and respect alongside physical achievement. It reminded everyone involved that the games were more than gold and silver. They were about who we become when we try. The symbols of the modern Olympics grew alongside these ideas. The 5 interlocking rings, blue, yellow, black, green, and red, were introduced in 1913. They represented the 5 inhabited continents, connected, not divided by ocean or border, but joined in movement. The Olympic torch relay was added in 1930, linking the modern games directly to ancient Olympia. Fire lit in the cradle of the original games, carried by hand across countries, mountains, and seas. And when the flame reached the stadium, it was not a roar that welcomed it, but often a hush, a pause, a breath. As if the world remembered, just briefly, what it meant to stand still together. Over time, new events were added: gymnastics, archery, basketball. Women, once excluded entirely, were welcomed, slowly, unevenly, but increasingly present. Nations once colonized arrived under their own flags. Refugees, once stateless, marched together in a team of hope. The games were not always just. They were not always safe from corruption or scandal, but within them, always, were moments that lifted the spirit. Jesse Owens running in Berlin, Nadia Comaneci scoring a perfect 10, Derek Redmond finishing a race with his father's help. These stories are not merely about sport. They are about perseverance, about grace, about the kind of peace that begins within one person and reaches outward. As the games entered the 21st century, technology brought them into every home. Billions watched, cheered, cried, and for a few days, every few years, the world was reminded not of what divides us, but of what inspires us. In Part 7, we will continue with the present age of the Olympics, the challenges they now face, the lessons they still teach, and the flame that continues to burn quietly despite the noise. But for now, breathe softly. Let the silence of the ancient stadium wrap around you. Let the rhythm of footsteps across sand lull your thoughts. And remember, the games were never about the loudest moment. They were about the quiet unity that comes from striving together towards something better. As the Olympic Games moved deeper into the 21st century, they became more than a series of sporting events. They evolved into global conversations about inclusion, identity, justice, and legacy. No longer confined to a single stadium or even a single country, the Olympics now stretched across time zones and platforms. Viewers followed the torch as it wound its way through ancient forests and modern cities. They watched athletes from countries both vast and tiny, each carrying hopes that often transcended sport. The spectacle grew. Opening ceremonies became performances of art and light, blending history with future dreams. Fireworks lit the sky above host cities, while dancers told stories of national heritage. Millions tuned in, billions even. And yet, amid the rising volume, the heart of the Olympics continued to beat in a slower rhythm. It pulsed through the personal stories of athletes who had overcome hardship, of competitors who had sacrificed everything for one fleeting moment. These stories rarely shouted. Instead, they whispered strength. They reminded audiences that even in a noisy world, grace and effort could still speak clearly. But as the games expanded, they also faced new challenges. Costs ballooned. Cities hesitated to host. Protests grew, not against sport itself, but against displacement, debt, and environmental strain. There were concerns about fairness, doping, and the commercialization of something once sacred. Questions were asked. Had the Olympics lost their way? Could they still hold space for peace in a restless world? The answers were never simple, but in response, the Olympic movement began to shift. Slowly, thoughtfully, efforts were made to make the Games more sustainable. Existing venues were reused. Ceremonies were scaled back. New guidelines encouraged hosts to blend grandeur with responsibility. At the same time, the roster of athletes changed. Representation deepened. More women, more people of color, more voices that had once been sidelined now stood at the podium. refugee teams reminded the world that humanity could not be divided by war forever. LGBTQ+ athletes competed openly. Nations long isolated arrived under their own flags. And each of these moments, small in the face of history, mattered deeply to those watching in silence from homes around the world. In Tokyo 2020, held in 2021 due to the global pandemic, the Games faced a silence unlike any before. No roaring crowds, no packed stadiums, just the steady beat of hearts under pressure. Masks covered faces, empty stands echoed with distant cheers from digital screens. And yet, athletes still competed. They still wept with joy. They still embraced. In that subdued atmosphere, the Olympics revealed something essential: that while celebration is part of the tradition, it is not the core. The core is resilience. It is the quiet decision to rise each morning and try again, to train alone, to hope quietly, to arrive despite the odds, and perform. Paris 2024 and future games beyond promise more change, more reflection, more effort to align the event with its true purpose, not just as a showcase, but as a reminder that even now, amid division and uncertainty, we can still come together, not perfectly, not without strain, but meaningfully. As the Olympic flame continues its journey across landscapes and generations, it passes through hands that hold more than just a torch. It passes through stories, sacrifices, triumphs, failures. It links us, not as spectators, but as participants in a shared human legacy. The ancient grove at Olympia may be silent now, its stones weathered and still, but its spirit lingers in every leap, every sprint, every quiet moment of preparation. The Games remind us of something easy to forget in the rush of life: that peace is not loud, it is steady, and that unity does not arrive with trumpets, but often with two athletes, standing side by side, breathing in the same moment. In Part 8, we will reflect on how the Olympic values have been carried outside the stadium, into schools, communities, and everyday lives. We will see how the peaceful origins of the Games still ripple through the choices of people who may never hold a medal, but who carry the spirit all the same. But for now, as the stars shine softly over empty arenas, let your thoughts drift into stillness. Let the flame glow gently in your imagination, and let the long, quiet story of the Olympic Games cradle you toward rest. Long after the applause fades and the stadium's empty, the Olympic spirit continues to live on, not just in headlines or record books, but in quieter places, far removed from podiums and bright lights. The true legacy of the Olympic Games stretches beyond the athletes who compete and the cities that host. It lives in classrooms, in community fields, in conversations among strangers, and in the silent resolve of those who choose perseverance over surrender. The Olympic values, excellence, respect, and friendship, were never meant to be confined to a 2-week celebration. They were designed to guide behavior, to inspire purpose, and to plant seeds that grow in unseen soil. Around the world, programs have emerged, some official, others grassroots, that use sport as a vehicle for peace. In refugee camps, makeshift tracks and soccer fields are drawn in dust. In struggling neighborhoods, coaches become mentors, teaching young people not just how to jump higher or run faster, but how to face adversity with dignity. In schools, children learn about the rings, the torch, and the ancient games, not just for history's sake, but to understand the idea that effort, fairness, and unity matter. That we are not simply competitors, we are fellow travelers on the same path, each striving toward our own version of greatness. The Olympic truce, revived in modern form, continues to ask the world for a pause, for a moment of stillness, for the possibility of dialogue instead of destruction. Though not always honored in practice, its presence is a reminder that even in times of conflict, humanity still dreams of harmony. And there are stories, quiet but powerful, of moments when sport has softened hard lines. A shared handshake between athletes from rival nations, a warm embrace between winners and those who fell short. Moments when politics were present but not loud, when human connection took precedence over flags and slogans. These are the moments that linger. The International Olympic Committee has continued to encourage education through sport, supporting initiatives that reach into corners of the world untouched by glamour or wealth. For many, the Olympics are not about winning, but about the chance to be seen, to be counted. to stand among equals and feel the weight of recognition. In the farthest reaches of the globe, young athletes practice with equipment made by hand. They dream under dim lights. They chase not only medals, but the promise that effort is meaningful, that striving, even unseen, carries worth. And when, on rare occasions, they qualify, when they enter a stadium with eyes wide and hearts pounding, they carry more than a flag. They carry a story, a place, a people. And even if they finish last, they return home as symbols of hope. The Olympic flame, passed from hand to hand across oceans and borders, does not burn only for champions. It burns for anyone who has ever tried, for anyone who has ever stood again after falling, for anyone who believes that challenge can coexist with kindness. In this way, the Olympics are not truly a sporting event. They are a mirror, reflecting the world as it is and as it could be. They show us resilience in the face of injury, grace in defeat, generosity in victory, and through all of it, a quiet current of unity. In recent years, as the world has become more connected, the ability to witness these moments has grown. Stories that once would have faded in the background now ripple across the internet. A runner helping another cross the finish line. A gymnast returning from injury with quiet courage. A weightlifter dedicating a win to her community back home. These stories are not scripted, they are not dramatic, but they are real. And they remind us that dignity is not reserved for the famous. It belongs to everyone. In Part 9, we will step back once more into the ancient past, to the forgotten athletes, the early champions, and the unsung heroes of Olympia. We will trace the journey from myth to memory and how the quiet deeds of those long gone still echo in the world today. But for now, rest your thoughts. Imagine the torch glowing in a quiet night. Picture the calm after the race, when breath slows and hearts settle, and feel in that stillness the gentle warmth of peace that lies at the heart of the Games. To truly understand the soul of the Olympic Games, one must return not to the global stadiums of modern cities, but to a quiet olive grove in western Greece. Ancient Olympia, nestled between the gentle curves of the Alpheus and Claudius rivers, was not merely a location for athletic contest. It was a sacred landscape, woven deeply into the mythology and memory of the Greek world. Here, amid the rustling of leaves and the hum of cicadas, athletes once gathered in humble reverence, not to dazzle, but to honor. Not to win for glory alone, but to compete before the gods. The earliest records place the first Olympic Games around 776 BCE, though the traditions may stretch even farther into shadowed antiquity. These early games were part of a religious festival in honor of Zeus, king of the gods. Olympia, unlike other city-states, was a place of neutrality. It welcomed participants from all corners of the Hellenic world, even those currently at war. For the duration of the Games, a sacred truce, known as the Ikacheria, was declared. It was a promise of safety, of suspended hostility, a chance for soldiers to become athletes, for enemies to sit side by side as spectators. The ancient events were simpler than today's elaborate spectacles. A single foot race, known as the stadion, dominated the early years. Athletes ran barefoot across a measured stretch of earth, watched not by roaring crowds, but by attentive judges and a few thousand gathered citizens. Over time, more contests were added: wrestling, discus, javelin, long jump, chariot racing, and the brutal pancration, a blend of boxing and wrestling with few rules. There were no medals, no national anthems. Victors were crowned with olive wreaths and immortalized with simple statues or odes. Yet these honors carried weight. A win at Olympia could elevate a man's standing for life. He might return to his city as a hero, exempt from taxes, or granted a place of honor in civic affairs. But the essence of the Games remained personal. It was about the pursuit of arete, excellence in all things. It was about shaping the body to reflect the spirit within. Ancient athletes trained in gymnasia, often under harsh discipline. They endured strict diets, intense exercise, and the scrutiny of trainers and officials, but they also trained their minds. Philosophy and sport walked hand in hand. The same men who competed in the stadium might have once sat in quiet dialogue with a teacher of ethics or rhetoric. Because in Greek thought, the athlete was not simply a body in motion, he was a soul in pursuit of balance. The Games lasted for 5 days. They began with rituals, sacrifices, processions, prayers. The statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, stood watchful and serene, reminding all who entered the stadium that this was not merely a contest of strength. It was a communion. As centuries passed, the games persisted, enduring wars, politics, and shifting empires. Even as Roman influence expanded and the Greek city-states declined, the Olympics continued. Emperors sent envoys, statues were added, victors' names were recorded in marble. But eventually, change arrived. By the 4th century CE, the Christianization of the Roman Empire began to view the pagan festivals with suspicion. The sacred rituals of Olympia were declared obsolete, and in 393 CE, under the decree of Emperor Theodosius I, the ancient Olympic Games were banned. For over 1,000 years, the stadium at Olympia lay silent. Columns toppled. Vine roots grew over the training grounds. The voices of spectators faded into myth, yet the spirit remained, buried perhaps, but not forgotten. When Pierre de Coubertin, centuries later, proposed the revival of the Olympic Games, he looked not to the triumphs of war, but to these very ancient ideals. He saw in the worn stones of Olympia a symbol of something the modern world had lost, a space where competition could uplift rather than divide. And so, in every torch-lighting ceremony, when the flame is once again ignited in that same grove, it is not simply fire that is reborn. It is memory. It is continuity. It is the breath of ancient athletes carried forward in time. In Part 10, we will close our journey by exploring how the Olympic flame continues to move through hearts and nations. How, even in a complex world, the quiet ideals of Olympia still offer a gentle light in the dark. But now, let your mind rest gently in the past. Picture the olive trees. Feel the soft soil beneath ancient feet. Hear the hush before the race begins. And know that the peace you feel now was once the dream of those who ran before you. As we bring this quiet journey to its end, we return to a single image, the Olympic flame, flickering gently against a darkened sky. It is not the flame of conquest or celebration. It is not the flash of fireworks or the blaze of spotlight. It is a whisper of warmth, a reminder that in the cold complexities of history, some ideas have quietly endured. The modern Olympic flame begins its journey in Olympia, lit in a ceremony that draws directly from the ancient world. A group of women dressed as priestesses, in robes modeled after classical styles, gather at the Temple of Hera. Using a parabolic mirror and the heat of the sun, they ignite the torch. No artificial flame, no shortcuts, just sunlight and silence. It is an act that connects the present to the past, not through words, but through ritual. From that moment, the torch travels across mountains, oceans, and borders. It passes through hands of athletes, teachers, refugees, children, elders. It is carried by runners, cyclists, and sometimes even by boats or planes. But no matter how it moves, the meaning is the same. We are all custodians of peace. We are all participants in a shared story. Each time the flame arrives in the host city, there is a pause, a breath. And then the games begin, not as a competition of nations, but as a gathering of individuals who believe in effort, fairness, and unity. Today's Olympics are far larger than anything the ancient Greeks imagined. Thousands of athletes from every continent arrive with support teams, journalists, and flags. There are ceremonies and sponsorships, politics, and planning. Yet within the complexity, the core remains. In the Olympic Village, athletes from rival countries share meals. They play music, exchange pins, and speak in the common language of sport. In stadiums, crowds cheer not only for the winners, but for those who finish last with courage. In quiet corners, volunteers help lost visitors find their way. These are the small moments that make the Olympics more than a show. They make it a mirror of what humanity can be when we choose connection over conflict. There have been difficult times, boycotts, protests, tragedies. The games have been used at times to make statements louder than sport. And yet, even then, there have been moments of grace. In 1960, a barefoot Ethiopian runner named Abebe Bikila won the marathon, reminding the world that greatness does not depend on wealth. In 1992, athletes from war-torn countries competed under a neutral Olympic flag, showing that the human spirit survives division. In 2016, the first ever refugee Olympic team marched into the opening ceremony, not representing a country, but a shared belief in dignity. These stories, quiet and persistent, form the heartbeat of the Games. They do not demand attention, but they leave an imprint. They remind us that every effort matters, that every act of respect, every display of courage, every gesture of friendship adds light to the world. The Olympics are not perfect. No institution is, but they offer a space, temporary, fragile, but real, where peace is practiced, where competition does not require enmity, where nations can stand side by side, not as adversaries, but as neighbors. And that matters, especially in a world that moves fast, argues loud, and forgets quickly. The peaceful origins of the Olympic Games are not a myth. They are a memory that still lives in the way athletes bow to each other before a match, in the way fans applaud for competitors from other countries, in the way a flame travels across the globe, never speaking, never shouting, only glowing with quiet purpose. So as you lie in stillness now, eyes soft and breath slow, remember that history is not always made by battles. Sometimes it is made by runners, by wrestlers, by gymnasts and swimmers and high jumpers who carry the weight of ancient hope. The hope that we can meet, not to fight, but to share space. To show what the human body and the human heart can do. And that, perhaps, is what makes the Olympics worth remembering. Not the records, not the medals, but the reminder that peace is not passive. It is practiced, quietly, steadily, together. Thank you for listening to this story. When you wake, may you carry its warmth with you into the day, and may the flame once lit never truly go out. Thank you so much for joining me on this peaceful journey through history. I hope you found calm and comfort in today's story. When you wake, may luck and success warmly greet you in all your work and endeavors. Until next time, rest well and take care.